Carl Jung, why losing what you loved was the first step to your becoming. The moment you lost what you loved most, something inside you died. You felt it, that sickening collapse, like the ground beneath your feet simply ceased to exist. Maybe it was a person who walked away. Maybe it was a dream that shattered. Maybe it was the life you'd built so carefully, reduced to rubble in a single day. And in that moment, you believed the story everyone tells about loss, that it's the end of something, that you'll spend the rest of your life trying to get back what was taken. But here's what no one told you, that death wasn't the end of you. It was the beginning. I know how that sounds, like some cheap consolation prize offered by people who've never stood where you're standing, never felt what you're feeling, like spiritual bypassing dressed up as wisdom. But stay with me, because what I'm about to share with you isn't comfort. It's something far more unsettling and far more true. It's a secret that Carl Jung spent his entire life trying to articulate, a truth so controversial that most people will reject it even as it's actively happening to them. The truth is this: loss isn't random cruelty. It isn't the universe punishing you, or proof that you're cursed, or evidence that nothing good can last. Loss is precise surgery. It's the unconscious mind, that vast intelligence beneath your awareness, performing an operation it knows you'd never consent to if asked. It's separating you from false attachments, from borrowed identities, from the version of yourself that needed to die so the real you could finally breathe. Let me tell you about Rebecca. Rebecca was 34 when her world ended, not metaphorically, literally, systematically ended. In the span of 12 months, she lost her fiancé to another woman, her dream job to corporate restructuring, and her mother to cancer. 3 pillars of her identity gone. She told me later that she used to lie in bed at night and feel like a ghost, like she'd already died, but her body hadn't gotten the message yet. For 18 months, she barely functioned. She moved through life like someone underwater, everything muffled and distant. Her friends offered the usual platitudes. Everything happens for a reason. Time heals all wounds. You'll get through this. She smiled and nodded and felt nothing. Because here's what nobody understood. Rebecca wasn't just grieving what she'd lost. She was grieving who she'd been. The woman who defined herself as someone's fiancé, someone's employee, someone's daughter. All those someones were gone, and she didn't know who she was without them. Then something strange began to happen. In the 3rd year after her losses, Rebecca started noticing things. Small things at first. She realized she'd stopped checking her phone every 30 seconds, stopped feeling that constant anxiety about being wanted, being needed, being validated. She started having thoughts she'd never had before, dangerous thoughts, authentic thoughts, desires that weren't about pleasing anyone else. She enrolled in a metalworking class, something she'd been curious about for years but never pursued, because her fiancé thought it was weird, and her mother thought it was unladylike, and her corporate job left no time for hobbies that didn't advance her career. She made a sculpture of a woman emerging from flames. She called it Phoenix? No, something else. By year 5, Rebecca had built an entirely new life. Not a rebuilt version of her old life, but something she couldn't have imagined before the losses. She'd started her own small business creating custom metalwork. She'd developed relationships based on authenticity rather than need. She'd discovered parts of herself that had been buried under layers of performance and expectation. And here's the thing that disturbed her most. She was grateful. Not grateful for the pain. Don't misunderstand. The loss had been genuine agony, and she'd never minimize that, but grateful for what the pain had revealed. She told me something I'll never forget. That year destroyed me, but it didn't destroy me. It destroyed the costume I was wearing. It murdered the performance I was giving. And underneath was this person I'd never met. This is going to sound insane, but I call it the year I was murdered into existence. Murdered into existence. Let that phrase sit with you for a moment, because that's what we're really talking about here. Not loss as tragedy, though it is tragic. Not grief as something to overcome, though you must move through it. We're talking about loss as initiation, as the violent, necessary death of the false self, as the universe's way of saying the becoming you're here for cannot happen while you're clutching the identity you've been performing. This is the forbidden truth that Jung circled around his entire life, the insight that makes people deeply uncomfortable because it suggests that suffering might not be meaningless, that maybe, just maybe, the worst thing that ever happened to you was also the most important thing that ever happened to you, not because it felt good or taught you a lesson you could summarize in a greeting card, but because it broke open the shell you'd been living inside. Think about what you loved and lost. I want you to really think about it for a moment. What was it? A person? A dream? A version of your life? Now here's the question that's going to haunt you. What if that thing you loved wasn't actually serving your becoming? What if in some way you couldn't see at the time it was preventing it? This isn't about blaming what you lost or diminishing its value. This is about recognizing a pattern that Jung observed again and again in his work with patients. We develop powerful attachments to people, dreams, and identities that feel absolutely essential to our survival. We build our entire sense of self around them. We say things like, I can't live without this, and this is who I am, and my life is over if I lose this. And then we lose it, and we don't die. We suffer. God, do we suffer? But we don't die. And in the space where that attachment used to be, something else begins to grow. Something that was always there but couldn't emerge, because all the light and air and soil were being used by what you were clinging to. Jung called this the process of individuation, becoming who you actually are rather than who you've been taught to be, who you've been expected to be, who you've been performing as. And here's the disturbing part. Individuation usually requires death. Not physical death, but psychological death. The death of the persona. The death of the ego's carefully constructed identity. The death of the false self. The universe doesn't take things away to destroy you. It takes them away to create space for the self you've never met. I know some of you are resisting this right now. You're thinking about what you lost and feeling angry that I would suggest it served some purpose. You're thinking, my loss was purely destructive. There's no gift in it. This is just another way of spiritualizing suffering to make it palatable. And I hear you. I honor that resistance. Because here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying your loss was meant to be or happened for a reason in some cosmic plan that makes it all okay. I'm not selling you destiny or divine purpose or meaning imposed from outside. What I'm saying is more intimate and more disturbing than that. I'm saying that your psyche, the vast unconscious intelligence within you, sometimes knows what your conscious ego cannot accept, that you've outgrown something you love, that you're trapped in an identity that isn't you, that your becoming requires a death you'd never choose. And so the unconscious creates circumstances, not maliciously, not to punish, but with the surgical precision of a doctor who knows that the tumor and the healthy tissue have become fused, and the only way to save your life is to cut. Jung wrote, I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become. But here's what most people miss in that quote. The choosing doesn't happen until after the happening. The becoming doesn't begin until after something ends. You cannot choose who you will be while you're still clinging to who you were. This is the central paradox we're going to explore together. What you loved might have been what was preventing your becoming, not because it was bad or wrong or unworthy of love, but because your ego had fused with it so completely that you couldn't tell where you ended and it began. You'd become psychologically enmeshed with something outside yourself, and the only way to discover who you are, the only way to meet the self beneath the attachments, was to lose what you'd attached to. The universe is not cruel, but it is committed to your wholeness, and wholeness cannot be achieved through addition, through accumulating. More relationships, more achievements, more identities, more proof that you are who you think you are. Wholeness is achieved through subtraction, through stripping away what is not essential, through losing what was never truly yours. This is going to be a difficult journey we're taking together. We're going to explore concepts that will make you uncomfortable. We're going to look at stories that will feel too close to your own. We're going to examine the mechanics of attachment and the architecture of identity, and the ways we use what we love to avoid becoming who we are. And through it all, I'm going to ask you to consider a possibility that feels almost cruel in its implications. That your loss, your grief, your devastation, all of it might have been the first step toward the becoming you came here for. Not because suffering is good, not because pain is noble, but because sometimes the self you're meant to be is buried so deep beneath the self you've been performing that nothing short of total collapse will reveal it. Rebecca, the woman who lost everything in a single year, told me something else I want you to hear. She said, "Before I lost it all, I thought I knew who I was. I had a whole identity built around being in love, being successful, being a good daughter. I thought those things were me, but they weren't me. They were just roles I was playing. And the universe looked at me, playing all those roles, and said, 'No, that's not why you're here. You have to become something else. And the only way I can show you what that is to take away all the costumes.' So here we are. All the costumes are gone or going. The roles are ending. The identities are crumbling. And in the wreckage, there's a question that won't stop asking itself. Who are you when you're not who you thought you were? Who remains when everything you identified with is stripped away? That question is terrifying. It's also the most important question you'll ever face, because the answer, the real answer, the one you discover not through thinking, but through becoming, that answer is what your entire life has been preparation for. The death you experienced wasn't the end of you. It was the beginning of you, the real you, the one who was always there, waiting beneath the attachments, beneath the performances, beneath the borrowed identities. Your becoming starts where your known world ends. And if you're reading this, if these words are landing somewhere deep in your chest, with a recognition that feels both terrifying and true, then you already know. Something in you has died. And something else, something you've never met but have always been, is starting to breathe. This is not recovery. This is not about getting back to who you were. This is about discovering who you've always been, underneath who you were taught to be. This is your becoming, and it begins with death. Before we can understand why losing what you loved was necessary, we need to understand what you were actually holding on to. Because here's something that will disturb you. What you call love isn't always love. Sometimes it's dependence. Sometimes it's projection. Sometimes it's the ego's desperate attempt to avoid meeting itself. Jung spent decades studying the mechanics of attachment, and what he discovered is both brilliant and unsettling. He found that the ego, your conscious sense of I, constructs its entire identity around external objects. Not just physical objects, but psychological ones, people, careers, dreams, roles, identities. The ego looks at these external things and says, "This is mine. This defines me. Without this, I am nothing." And then it calls that process love. But love and attachment are not the same thing, not even close. Let me introduce you to the concept of psychic investment, one of Jung's most powerful ideas. Jung used the term libido, but he didn't mean it in the Freudian sexual sense. He meant psychic energy, the life force, the animating principle, the stuff of consciousness itself. And this energy doesn't just float around inside you, it gets invested. You pour it into things outside yourself, into relationships, into careers, into identities, into dreams. When you invest enough psychic energy into something external, a strange fusion occurs. The boundary between you and that thing starts to dissolve. You begin to experience threats to it as threats to yourself, challenges to it as challenges to your existence, loss of it as loss of self. The investment has become so total that you can no longer distinguish between your identity and what you're identified with. This is why loss feels like death, because psychologically it is death. The ego experiences the removal of what it's fused with as its own annihilation. Let me tell you about Marcus. Marcus was a CEO. Not just any CEO, one of those titans you read about in business magazines, the kind of leader who gets profiled and quoted and held up as an example of success. For 23 years, he built his company from nothing into a market leader worth hundreds of millions. He was there before dawn, left after midnight. He made every major decision. He knew every employee's name. The company wasn't just his job, it was his identity, his purpose, his proof that he mattered. Then came the hostile takeover, swift, brutal, efficient. Within 6 months, Marcus was out. They gave him a generous severance package and thanked him for his service. And that was that. 23 years reduced to a corporate press release. Marcus told me what happened next was like watching himself die from the outside. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think. He'd get in his car to go somewhere and forget where he was going. He'd start to introduce himself at social events and freeze, because without the title, without the company, who was he? His wife noticed he kept checking his old work email, even though they'd shut off his access. He'd refresh it compulsively, as if the system had made a mistake, as if they'd reinstate him, as if the part of him that had been the CEO could somehow come back from the dead. In therapy, Marcus said something that captures the essence of toxic attachment. I wasn't the CEO of my company, I was my company. Every success it had was my success. Every failure was my failure. When I lost the company, I didn't lose my job. I lost my proof that I existed. This is what Jung called identity fusion, the complete enmeshment of ego and external object. Marcus had poured so much psychic energy into his company for so long that there was no longer a clean boundary between self and role. The CEO wasn't something he did, it was something he was. And when that was taken away, the ego experienced it as self-annihilation. But here's what's crucial to understand. Marcus's devastation wasn't really about losing the company. It was about losing the identity structure the company provided. Because underneath the CEO persona, Marcus had no idea who he was. He'd never developed a self independent of achievement, independent of external validation, independent of the role. The company had been serving as a container for his unlived self. Instead of facing who he actually was, his vulnerabilities, his fears, his authentic desires, he'd poured all that energy into building an empire. The empire collapsed, and suddenly there was nowhere left to hide. This is the first type of toxic attachment, identity fusion. When you can't tell where you end and the thing you love begins. When threats to it feel like threats to your existence. When you say, I am, and the only words that follow are roles, relationships, or achievements external to yourself. The second type is projected wholeness. This is when you place disowned parts of yourself onto someone or something else, then become addicted to their presence because they're carrying qualities you refuse to embody. We'll explore this in much more depth later, but for now, understand this. Sometimes you're not actually in love with a person. You're in love with the parts of yourself you see reflected in them, The parts you've rejected or suppressed or been taught are unacceptable. The third type is the unlived life substitute. This is when you invest in a dream, a path, a version of yourself that isn't actually authentic, it's borrowed. Maybe it's your parents' dream for you. Maybe it's society's definition of success. Maybe it's what you think you should want rather than what you actually want. You pour years or decades into this false dream, and losing it feels catastrophic because you've organized your entire life around it. But underneath the devastation is a secret relief, because some part of you always knew it wasn't really yours. The fourth type is the shadow container. This is when you use what you love as a repository for all the darkness you refuse to acknowledge in yourself. Your rage, your selfishness, your capacity for cruelty. You project it outward and then either avoid certain people or relationships, or you're drawn to them because they're acting out what you won't admit in yourself. When you lose a shadow container, it's terrifying because now you have nowhere to put those qualities. You have to face them in yourself. All four types have something in common. They turn what you love into a psychological crutch, into a way of avoiding the hard work of becoming, into a substitute for the authentic self. And here's where Jung's insight becomes almost cruel in its precision. The unconscious knows. Some deep part of you knows when you're using love as avoidance, when you're using relationships as distraction, when you're using achievement as armor against self-confrontation. The unconscious knows, and eventually it intervenes. Not because it's punishing you, not because you've done something wrong, but because your becoming, your individuation, your journey to wholeness cannot proceed while you're hiding behind attachments. Jung wrote, "Where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, there love is lacking." Read that again. Because what he's saying is that true love and ego attachment are opposites. Where you find authentic love, you find surrender, acceptance, freedom. Where you find ego attachment, you find control, possession, fusion. Most of what we call love is actually the ego's attempt to secure itself, to prove itself, to complete itself through external means. And the tragedy is that this prevents actual love, the kind that sees another person as separate, that honors their autonomy, that doesn't need them to complete you because you're already whole. This is why attachment creates suffering, not because loving is wrong, but because the ego's version of love is fundamentally about power, about controlling the source of your wholeness, about making sure the external object you fused with never leaves, never changes, never stops serving as your identity scaffold. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with this question. What are you fused with right now? What person, role, dream, or identity can you not imagine existing without? What makes you say, "I am," and what words automatically follow? What would feel like death if you lost it? Write it down if you can, because here's what I'm going to suggest. Whatever you just wrote down is probably the thing standing between you and your becoming. Not because it's bad, not because you shouldn't value it, but because the intensity of your attachment reveals the depth of your avoidance. You're using that thing, that person, that role, that dream to avoid meeting yourself. And the unconscious is watching, taking notes, preparing the surgery. Marcus, the CEO who lost his company, told me something profound 2 years into his recovery. He said, "I used to think the takeover was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Now I realize it was the only thing that could have forced me to discover I'm an actual person, not just a title. I'd spent 23 years building a company to avoid building a self. The universe just called my bluff. The universe just called my bluff." That phrase should terrify and liberate you in equal measure. Because if Marcus is right, if loss is the unconscious calling the ego's bluff, then everything changes. Your loss stops being random tragedy and becomes precise intervention. The thing you loved stops being cruelly taken and becomes compassionately removed. The devastation stops being meaningless and becomes the most meaningful thing that's ever happened to you. But only if you're willing to ask the question Marcus eventually asked, what was I really attached to? Was it love or was it need? Was it authentic connection or was it ego construction? Was it about the thing itself or was it about avoiding myself? These questions are brutal. They require a level of honesty most people never access because it feels too much like betrayal. Betrayal of what you lost, of the grief you've experienced, of the story you've been telling about your loss. But Jung would insist that this honesty is the only path to freedom. Because here's the final insight of this chapter, the one that makes everything else make sense. The ego's attachments are not random, they're strategic. Every attachment serves a purpose, to avoid something the ego doesn't want to face. And every loss, therefore, is an invitation to face exactly what you've been avoiding. You loved what you loved for a reason, but you might have loved it not because it was right for you, but because it was convenient for your avoidance. And now it's gone, and the avoidance is no longer possible, and you're standing face to face with the thing you've been running from your entire life. Yourself. The real one. The one beneath the roles and relationships and achievements. The one who exists independent of external validation. The one who is whole even when nothing outside confirms it. That self is what your loss has revealed. That self is what your becoming is about. That self is who you've always been but couldn't access while you were fused with everything outside yourself. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he didn't say the path to that becoming would be comfortable. He didn't say it would be something you'd choose willingly. He said it's a privilege, which means it's rare, hard-won, and demands everything from you. Your loss demanded everything from you. It took what you thought defined you, and in doing so, it revealed the you that exists beneath definition. Now the question is, are you brave enough to meet that person, the one who remains when all the attachments are gone, the one who exists not because of what they have or who they're with or what they've achieved, but simply because they are? That's the person your loss was trying to introduce you to. That's the becoming waiting on the other side of your devastation. But first, you have to understand what's been preventing you from meeting them all along. You have to understand the architecture of your attachments. You have to look honestly at what you've been clinging to and why. And that's where we're going next, because the attachment runs even deeper than identity fusion. It runs all the way down to the persona, the mask you wear, the performance you give, the version of yourself you've been showing the world, while the real you suffocates beneath it. Your loss didn't just take what you loved. It destroyed the costume you were wearing, and now, naked and exposed, you're about to discover whether there's anything underneath. Spoiler, there is. And it's been waiting for you your entire life. There's a version of you that goes to work every day, that shows up to family dinners, that posts on social media, that makes small talk at parties, that performs the role of partner, parent, professional, friend. This version is polished, practiced, calibrated to be acceptable. It knows what to say, how to act, what to hide, what to emphasize. It's the face you show the world. Jung called it the persona, and it is not you. The persona is a mask, a necessary mask to be sure, because none of us can survive in society without some form of social adaptation. But somewhere along the way, a tragic confusion occurs. You start to believe the mask is your face. The performance becomes your identity. The role becomes yourself. And then, when circumstances tear the mask away, you experience it not as losing a costume, but as losing your skin. This is what persona collapse feels like being flayed alive, like standing naked in front of everyone who's ever known you and realizing you don't know who you are without the mask, like dying, except you're still alive, still breathing, still expected to function, but the you who functioned is gone. Let me tell you about Sarah. Sarah was a mother, not just any mother, the mother. The one who organized the carpool and remembered everyone's allergies and showed up to every school event and baked from scratch and kept a spotless home and made motherhood look effortless. For 26 years, from the birth of her first child to the day her youngest left for college, Sarah's entire existence revolved around one identity: mom. She was good at it. No, she was exceptional. Her children were well-adjusted, successful, genuinely fond of her. Her husband appreciated her dedication. Her friends admired her commitment. Everyone agreed Sarah was born to be a mother. Then came the empty nest. The first few weeks were fine. She kept busy with cleaning projects, reorganizing rooms, planning visits. But as the months stretched on, something started to crack. Sarah would wake up at 6 in the morning, her body still trained to the rhythm of school mornings, and lie in bed staring at the ceiling thinking, what am I supposed to do now? She tried picking up old hobbies. She joined book clubs and volunteer organizations. She told herself this was the freedom she'd been waiting for, the chance to finally focus on herself. But every activity felt hollow, performative, like she was playing at being a person rather than actually being one. Her husband noticed she'd started crying at random times. In the grocery store, walking past the cereal her kids used to eat. At night, scrolling through old photos. Once he found her in their youngest daughter's room, just sitting on the bed in the dark, holding a stuffed animal. I don't know who I am, she told him. I keep waiting to feel like myself again, but I don't have a self to feel like. I've been mom for so long that there's nothing underneath. It's like I'm a ghost, like I died when they left, but nobody noticed because I'm still walking around. This is persona collapse in its purest form. Sarah hadn't lost her children. They were thriving, calling regularly, visiting for holidays. What she'd lost was her identity, the role that gave her life meaning, structure, purpose. Without it, she wasn't grieving an absence. She was experiencing an existential crisis. Because here's what Sarah was only beginning to realize. She'd never actually developed a self beyond motherhood. For 26 years, she'd poured every ounce of her psychic energy into the role of mom. Every decision, every sacrifice, every thought, all of it organized around her children's needs. And somewhere in that process, the woman she might have become got shelved, forgotten, buried beneath the persona. The persona isn't inherently bad. We all need social masks to navigate the world. But the tragedy occurs when the mask becomes permanent, when you forget you're wearing it, when you live so long inside the role that you mistake it for identity. Jung warned about this extensively. He wrote about patients who'd built entire lives around their personas: the successful businessman, the dutiful wife, the respected doctor, only to experience devastating collapse when circumstances forced the persona's removal. Retirement, divorce, illness, loss of status, any of these could trigger the same existential crisis Sarah was experiencing. What they're grieving isn't actually what they lost. It's who they thought they were. This is crucial to understand, so let me say it again. In persona collapse, the primary grief isn't for the external circumstance. It's for the internal identity. It's the terrifying discovery that you've been performing a character for so long that you've lost contact with the actor beneath. Sarah's therapist gave her an exercise Jung used with his own patients. It's called the persona audit, and it's simple but devastating. Make a list of all the ways you'd complete the sentence, I am. Then, next to each one, mark whether it's a role, something you do, a relationship, something you are to someone else, or an essence, something intrinsic to your being. Sarah made her list. I am a mother. I am a wife. I am a volunteer. I am a homemaker. I am a good listener. I am organized. I am nurturing. I am dependable. Then she did the marking: mother, role, wife, relationship, volunteer, role, homemaker, role, good listener. This one stumped her. Was it essence or performance? She realized she'd trained herself to be a good listener because mothers should be good listeners. It was part of the persona, organized, role, nurturing. This felt more essential, but even here, she couldn't separate it from motherhood. Dependable. Role. When she finished, Sarah was staring at a list of roles and relationships with almost nothing that could be called essence, nothing that existed independent of external function, nothing that would remain if every role and relationship were stripped away. "Who am I if I'm not any of these things?" she asked her therapist, and her therapist said, "That's the question your loss is asking you to answer." This is what loss does when it's the persona being lost. It reveals the architecture of your identity and shows you how much of it was borrowed, performed, constructed for external consumption. And then it asks the most important question you'll ever face. What remains when all the costumes are removed? For most people, this question induces panic, because the answer appears to be nothing. There's a terrifying void where a self should be, an emptiness that feels like erasure. But Jung would insist that this void is not empty. It's not absence. It's potential. It's not death. It's pregnancy. The void you're experiencing in persona collapse is actually space, room for something that couldn't exist before because the persona was taking up all the room. Think of it like this. Imagine you've been wearing a heavy suit of armor your entire adult life. The armor is beautiful, impressive, protective. It's won you respect and validation. It's kept you safe from judgment and rejection. But it's also incredibly heavy. It restricts your movement. It makes everything you do stiff and awkward and exhausting. One day, circumstances force the armor off. Maybe it rusts. Maybe it breaks. Maybe someone stronger than you removes it by force. And suddenly you're standing there without it, and you feel vulnerable and exposed and wrong. But you also feel something else. Lighter. More mobile. Able to move in ways the armor never permitted. And underneath the armor, there's skin. Real skin. Your skin. Scarred, maybe, soft in some places, calloused in others, imperfect but authentic. That skin, that vulnerable, authentic self beneath the armor, that's what's been waiting for you your entire life. The persona has been protecting it, yes, but also suppressing it. And now that the persona is gone, you have a choice. You can scramble to build a new armor, a new mask, a new performance, or you can learn to live as the self beneath. Sarah chose the latter, though it took her almost 3 years to fully commit to it. The first year was grief, mourning not just the empty nest, but the version of herself that had been the perfect mother. The second year was exploration, trying different activities and identities, most of which didn't fit because she was still trying to find a role rather than discover essence. The third year was breakthrough. Sarah stopped asking, "What should I be?" and started asking, "What do I actually want?" The shift seems subtle, but it's revolutionary because should questions are persona questions. They're about finding the right role, the right performance, the right way to be acceptable. Want questions are self-questions. They require you to tune into something beneath the social conditioning, beneath the expectations, beneath the masks. What Sarah discovered was that she loved writing, not the kind of writing that gets published or wins awards, just the act of sitting alone with her thoughts and putting them on paper. She'd never known this about herself because she'd never had time for it, never prioritized it, never believed it was worthy of her attention compared to her responsibilities as a mother. She also discovered she was angry, deeply, profoundly angry, at her husband for never questioning her total absorption in motherhood, at her children for growing up and leaving, at herself for building an entire identity around a temporary role. at society for telling women that self-sacrifice is the highest form of love. The anger scared her at first. It felt incompatible with the nurturing, selfless persona she'd inhabited for decades. But her therapist helped her see that the anger was actually authentic. It was real feeling that had been suppressed because the persona didn't permit it, and feeling it, allowing herself to experience it without judgment, was part of reclaiming her authentic self. By year 5, Sarah had written a memoir about her experience of losing herself in motherhood and finding herself in its aftermath. She never published it, never even showed it to anyone. That wasn't the point. The point was that she'd created something that came from her, not from the role of mom, not from any persona at all, just from the self that had been buried for 26 years. She told me something that captures the essence of persona collapse and recovery. Losing my purpose as a mother was the most painful thing I've ever experienced, but it wasn't actually a loss, it was a revelation. I hadn't lost my purpose. I'd never had one. I'd had a role, and underneath the role was a person I'd never met. The pain wasn't the loss grieving me, it was me, grieving the decades I'd spent hiding from myself. Me, grieving the decades I'd spent hiding from myself. That's what persona collapse really is. It's the authentic self grieving its own suppression. It's the recognition that what you lost wasn't who you are. It was who you pretended to be. And the grief is for all the years you spent performing instead of being. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he never said becoming who you are would be comfortable. He never said it wouldn't require loss. He never said the persona would go quietly. The persona fights for its survival. It was constructed for good reasons, to protect you, to help you fit in, to win approval and avoid rejection. It served you for years or decades. It gave you identity when you had no other source of identity. So when circumstances threaten to remove it, the ego experiences existential terror. This is why persona collapse feels like death. Because to the ego, which has fused completely with the mask, losing the persona is losing everything. But to the self, that deeper, wiser intelligence Jung spent his career trying to understand, losing the persona is liberation. The self has been waiting beneath the mask your entire life. It's been sending signals, whispering, trying to get your attention, but the persona was too loud, too convincing, too validated by external approval. So the self had to wait, and wait, and wait, until circumstances created a crack, until loss forced the mask to slip, until you had no choice but to confront the uncomfortable question, who am I when I'm not performing? Now we're going to explore something that will fundamentally change how you understand every relationship you've ever had, every person you've ever loved, and every loss that's ever devastated you. This is the part where Jung's psychology becomes almost shamanic in its insight, where the veil gets pulled back and you see the true mechanics of human connection. What I'm about to tell you is going to be uncomfortable. It's going to make you question whether you've ever truly loved anyone, whether you've ever been loved for who you actually are, whether any of your relationships have been authentic. And that discomfort is precisely why most people never go here, never look this deeply, never question the stories they tell themselves about love and loss. But you're here because something in you is ready for the truth. So here it is. Often, what you lost was never actually yours. It was a projection screen for parts of yourself you refused to embody. Let me unpack that because it sounds abstract and psychological, and what we're talking about is viscerally, devastatingly real. Jung discovered something remarkable in his work with patients. We don't see other people as they actually are. We see them through the lens of our own unconscious, and more specifically, we project onto them the qualities, characteristics, and potentials that we've disowned in ourselves. The parts we've rejected, suppressed, or been taught are unacceptable. He called this material the shadow. Everything you refuse to be, everything you've decided is not me. Everything you've exiled from your conscious identity. And here's the mechanism that changes everything. Once you've exiled something into your shadow, you don't stop encountering it. You start seeing it everywhere, in other people, in characters, in movies, in strangers on the street. Your psyche projects the shadow outward and then becomes fascinated, repelled, or addicted to whatever's carrying the projection. This is the secret architecture of most relationships. You're not actually relating to the other person. You're relating to your own disowned self, which you've unconsciously placed onto them. Let me tell you about David. David was 39 when his wife left him. 8 years of marriage ended with a text message while he was on a business trip. He came home to half-empty closets and a note that said, "I can't be your emotional container anymore. I need to find myself." The devastation was total. David couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't function. He took a leave from his high-powered finance job, something he'd never done even when his father died. His friends watched him unravel and did what friends do. They told him she wasn't worth it, that he'd find someone better, that time would heal. But none of it helped, because David wasn't just grieving the loss of his wife. He was grieving something he couldn't name, something that felt like losing access to his own soul. 6 months into therapy, his analyst asked him a question that cracked everything open. What did your wife give you that you couldn't give yourself? David's immediate answer was love, support, companionship. The usual things people say. His analyst pushed, no, what did she embody that you don't allow yourself to embody? David sat with that question for 3 full sessions before he could answer. And when he finally did, his voice was barely a whisper. She was soft. She cried openly. She talked about feelings like they mattered more than facts. She made decisions based on intuition instead of logic. She painted and gardened and did things just because they brought her joy, not because they were productive. She was everything I've spent my entire life trying not to be. There it was. The projection revealed. David had grown up with a father who believed emotions were weakness, that men should be rational, controlled, productive. He'd internalized that completely. By the time he was 10, he'd learned to suppress anything that felt soft, vulnerable, or impractical. He became brilliant, successful, respected, and completely cut off from half of his own psyche. Then he met a woman who embodied everything he'd rejected. She was emotional, intuitive, creative, unguarded. And he didn't fall in love with her. He fell in love with his own disowned feminine qualities, which he'd unconsciously projected onto her. For 8 years, David lived in an elaborate psychological arrangement. He got to experience softness, creativity, and emotional depth by proxy through his wife, without having to admit those qualities existed in him. She became his anima, Jung's term for the unconscious feminine aspect of a man's psyche. He'd placed his entire inner feminine onto her and then became addicted to her presence because she was carrying half of his wholeness. The marriage was never actually a relationship between 2 whole people. It was a projection system. David needed his wife to be emotional so he didn't have to be. Needed her to be intuitive so he could stay rational. Needed her to be vulnerable so he could stay defended. And she, for her own complex reasons, had accepted the role until she couldn't anymore. When she left, David experienced it as losing his capacity for feeling, for softness, for anything that wasn't pure logic and productivity, because that's exactly what had happened, psychologically. The container for his disowned self had walked out the door, and suddenly he was faced with either integrating those qualities himself or living as a partial human being for the rest of his life. This is what projection does. It creates a form of addiction, not to the person themselves, but to the wholeness they represent. You become dependent on their presence because they're carrying parts of you that you refuse to own. And when they leave, it feels like amputation, like losing a limb, losing your vision, losing some essential capacity. But here's the truth that's both brutal and liberating. You're not mourning them. You're mourning your disowned wholeness. Let me be very clear about what I'm saying here because it's easy to misunderstand. I'm not saying David didn't love his wife. I'm not saying she was just a projection screen and nothing more. What I'm saying is that the intensity of his devastation, the completeness of his collapse, revealed that something more than love was operating. It revealed dependency on her to be what he wouldn't let himself be. Authentic love can grieve. Authentic love can hurt when it ends. But authentic love doesn't experience the loss as self-annihilation because authentic love sees the other person as separate, whole, autonomous. Projection-based attachment experiences loss as annihilation because the other person was functioning as part of your psyche, and now that part is gone. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But he could have gone further. Everything we love obsessively about others is often what we've refused to love in ourselves. Think about your own relationships. Think about the person whose loss devastated you. Now ask yourself David's question. What did they embody that you don't allow yourself to embody? Was it confidence, wildness, vulnerability, intelligence, playfulness, darkness, ambition, stillness? Whatever quality immediately comes to mind, that's likely your projection. That's what you placed on them, what you secretly needed them to carry for you. And here's the mechanism that makes projection so insidious. The more you project onto someone, the more idealized they become. You stop seeing their actual complexity, their flaws, their humanity. You see them as the embodiment of what you lack. They become larger than life, perfect, essential to your survival. This is why people describe lost loves in such extreme terms. She was the only one who understood me. He was my soulmate. I'll never find anyone like them again. These statements feel true, feel profound, but they're often projection speaking. What they really mean is, they were carrying parts of me I've never integrated, and I don't know how to access those parts without them. David spent the next 2 years doing what Jung called withdrawing projections, the painful, humbling process of reclaiming what you've placed on others. His therapist guided him through 4 stages, and I want to walk you through them because this is the actual work of healing from projection-based loss. Stage 1. Recognition of projection. This is the hardest stage because it requires admitting that your love wasn't as pure or selfless as you believed. It requires recognizing that you were using another person to avoid your own wholeness. For David, recognition came through a simple but devastating exercise, listing every quality he'd loved about his wife, then honestly asking whether he possessed that quality himself, but had refused to acknowledge it. Emotional. David discovered he was actually deeply emotional, but he'd trained himself to suppress it so completely that he experienced his feelings as dangerous, foreign, unacceptable. His wife's emotionality had allowed him to experience feeling by proxy. Creative. David had loved painting as a child, but stopped at 12 when his father called it a waste of time. He'd buried that creative impulse so deep that he'd convinced himself he had no artistic capacity. His wife's creativity had let him experience art without the vulnerability of creating it himself. Intuitive. David made every decision through logic and data, but he'd often have gut feelings he'd ignore or rationalize away. His wife's intuition had served as a surrogate for his own inner knowing. The recognition phase is brutal because it means admitting, I didn't lose them. I lost my excuse not to be whole. Stage 2. Grief for the false relationship. Once you recognize projection, you have to grieve the relationship you thought you had, because if significant parts of your love were projection, then the relationship wasn't what you believed. This doesn't mean it wasn't real or valuable, but it does mean it was contaminated by unconscious material. David had to mourn the fantasy of his marriage, the story he'd told himself about who they were together, what they meant to each other. He had to accept that his wife had been carrying an impossible burden, being herself while also functioning as his disowned feminine. This stage is where many people get stuck. They'd rather cling to the idealized memory than face the truth that projection was operating, because facing the truth means admitting, I didn't fully see them. I was partly in love with my own shadow. Stage 3. Integration of the disowned quality. This is where the real work happens. Now you have to become what you projected. You have to embody the qualities you placed on the lost other. For David, this meant learning to be emotional, not fake emotional, not expressing feelings in therapy while remaining defended in life, but actually allowing himself to feel without immediately rationalizing or suppressing. It meant crying. It meant admitting vulnerability. It meant telling his friends, I'm not okay, instead of performing strength. It meant picking up painting again, terribly at first, embarrassingly, but doing it anyway because the creative impulse was his, not his ex-wife's. It meant trusting his intuition, making decisions based on gut feeling sometimes instead of always demanding logical proof. This integration phase can take years, because you're not just learning a new skill, you're reclaiming an exiled part of yourself. You're undoing decades of conditioning that told you this quality was unacceptable, dangerous, or not you. David described it as becoming a whole person for the first time in my life, not half a person desperately seeking someone to be the other half. Actually whole. Stage 4. Authentic relating. Only after integration can authentic relationship become possible, because now you're not looking for someone to carry your shadow. You're not seeking completion through another person. You're already complete, imperfectly, messily, but fundamentally complete. Authentic relating means seeing another person as they actually are, not as a screen for your projections. It means loving them for their reality, not for what they represent. It means recognizing that they are whole and separate, that they exist independent of your needs. David eventually entered a new relationship, and he told me the difference was night and day. With my ex-wife, I needed her. I couldn't imagine existing without her. It felt like love, but it was actually dependency. Now, I love my partner, but I don't need her to complete me. I was already complete when we met. The relationship is about two whole people choosing each other, not two half people trying to make one whole person. This is the goal of projection withdrawal, not to stop loving, but to start loving authentically. To see people as they are instead of as containers for your disowned self. But here's what makes this teaching so relevant to loss. Most people never do this work until loss forces them to. As long as the projection container is present, you can maintain the illusion. You can keep experiencing your disowned qualities by proxy. Keep avoiding the integration. Keep living as a partial self. Loss destroys that option. When the person carrying your projection leaves or dies, you're suddenly faced with a choice. Integrate what you projected, or spend the rest of your life seeking another person to carry it for you. Most people choose the latter. They enter rebound relationships. They search for someone just like who they lost. They try to recreate the projection system. But some people like David, people perhaps like you, choose integration. They choose to become what they've been worshiping. They choose wholeness over dependency. And here's the shocking truth that Jung spent his career trying to articulate. Loss is often the psyche's way of saying, stop giving your power away. Become what you've been projecting. The universe, or the self, that deeper intelligence within you, looked at your projection-based attachment and said, "No, that's not why you're here. You're not here to find someone to be what you won't let yourself be. You're here to become whole. And the only way I can teach you that is to remove the projection screen." It's a brutal teaching. It feels cruel when you're in the middle of it. But it's also the most compassionate thing that could happen, because living as a partial person, forever dependent on others to carry your disowned self, is a kind of living death. Your loss might have been the universe forcing you to reclaim your projections, to integrate your shadow, to become what you've been loving in others but refusing to embody yourself. Let me give you a framework for understanding your own projections. Ask yourself these questions about the person or thing you lost. What qualities did they embody that I most admired? Do I possess these qualities myself but refuse to acknowledge or express them? What did their presence allow me to experience without having to be? What am I now forced to become that I could avoid being while they were here? Write down your answers. Be ruthlessly honest, because this is the path to transformation, recognizing that what you lost wasn't just external, it was also internal. The person is gone, yes, but the qualities they represented, those are still available. They're in you. They've always been in you. You just needed them to carry those qualities because you weren't ready to admit they were yours. Now you're ready, or more accurately, now you have no choice. The projection screen is gone. You can't experience your disowned self by proxy anymore. You have to integrate it, embody it, become it. This is what Jung meant when he said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Because accepting yourself completely means accepting even the parts you projected onto others. The softness you called weakness, the wildness you called irresponsibility, the confidence you called arrogance, the vulnerability you called neediness. All of it is you. All of it has always been you. You just needed distance, needed to see it in someone else before you could admit it was yours. Your loss is saying, the distance is gone. The projection screen is removed. Now look in the mirror and see what's been there all along. David told me something in our final session that I want you to hear. He said, "I spent 8 years married to my own anima without realizing it. When she left, I thought I lost my capacity for feeling, for creativity, for softness. But I didn't lose it. I just lost the excuse not to embody it. The divorce was the best thing that ever happened to me, even though it was also the most painful, because it forced me to become whole instead of remaining half. The best thing and the most painful thing, not despite each other, but because of each other. The pain was the price of wholeness. The loss was the catalyst for integration. And that's the terrible gift of projection withdrawal. You get to become everything you've been loving in others but refusing to be yourself. You get to reclaim your wholeness. You get to stop searching outside yourself for qualities that were always within you. But the price is humility. The price is admitting you didn't love as purely as you thought. The price is recognizing that your intense attachments were often your projections calling you home. Jung wrote, "Where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, there love is lacking." Projection is the ego's will to power, the attempt to control your wholeness by placing it outside yourself, where you can possess it, manage it, keep it separate. Authentic love is the surrender of that power, the recognition that wholeness comes through integration, not possession. Your loss destroyed your power over your projections, and in doing so, it freed you to finally become what you've been seeking your entire life. Not someone else to complete you, not another projection screen to carry your shadow, but yourself, complete, integrated, whole. The person you lost didn't take anything from you when they left. They gave something back, the parts of yourself you'd placed on them. Now those parts are homeless, and they're asking to come home. Will you let them in? Will you become what you've been projecting? That's what your loss is asking. That's what your becoming requires. And it starts with the most humbling admission you'll ever make. I didn't lose them. I lost my excuse not to be whole. Now there's no excuse left. Only choice. Only becoming. We need to talk about something most people never consider. The possibility that what you lost wasn't actually yours. Not in the projection sense we just explored, but in a more fundamental way. The possibility that the dream you were pursuing, the path you were on, the life you were building, it wasn't your life at all. It was borrowed. This is Jung's concept of the unlived life, and it's one of his most haunting insights. He believed that many people spend entire lifetimes pursuing dreams that don't belong to them. Dreams inherited from parents, absorbed from culture, adopted to win approval or avoid rejection. And the tragedy isn't the pursuit itself, but what gets sacrificed in that pursuit. The authentic life that was possible, the real self that never got to emerge. But here's where this becomes relevant to loss. Sometimes the universe destroys what you thought you wanted to protect you from a life of unconscious performance. Sometimes what feels like the worst thing that ever happened to you is actually a violent course correction, the unconscious intervening to save you from wasting your life on someone else's dream. Let me tell you about Elena. Elena was a classical pianist, not just competent, brilliant. She'd been playing since age 4, trained at prestigious conservatories, performed with orchestras across Europe by her mid-20s. Everyone who heard her play agreed. She was destined for greatness. Her parents, both musicians, had recognized her talent early and devoted everything to her development. Her identity, her purpose, her entire life trajectory, all organized around piano. At 28, she was in a car accident. Drunk driver ran a red light. Elena survived, but her hands didn't, not in any form that could play professionally again. Nerve damage, reconstructive surgeries, endless physical therapy. The doctors were optimistic she'd regain about 70% function. For daily life, that would be fine. For a concert pianist, it was a death sentence. The first year was exactly what you'd expect. Devastation, rage, depression. Elena described it as mourning my own death while still being alive. She went through all the stages of grief, attempted the physical therapy with obsessive dedication, consulted specialist after specialist, hoping for a miracle that never came. The second year was worse because the initial acute grief had faded, but nothing had replaced it. Elena was alive but purposeless, functional but meaningless. Her friends tried to help. You could teach. You could compose. You could find a new passion. Every suggestion felt like an insult, like they were asking her to betray everything she'd been. It was in the third year in therapy that something shifted. Her therapist asked her a question she'd never considered. Did you love playing piano? Elena's immediate response was defensive. Of course I loved it. It was my entire life. Her therapist pushed. No, did you love it, or did you love what it gave you? Elena couldn't answer. The question felt wrong, incomprehensible. How could she separate her love of piano from what it gave her, from her parents' pride, from the audience's applause, from the validation of being exceptional? Her therapist tried a different angle. Imagine you could play piano again, but only in a room by yourself. No performances, no recordings, no one would ever hear you. Would you still want to play? The silence that followed that question lasted 3 full sessions, because Elena was realizing something that felt like betrayal. She wasn't sure she would. When she imagined playing without the audience, without the recognition, without the proof that she was special, the desire evaporated. What remained was obligation, training, habit, but not love, not joy, not authentic calling. She'd spent 24 years pursuing excellence in something she'd never actually chosen. Her parents had chosen it. 4-year-old Elena had been good at it, and her parents had seen potential, and from that moment forward the trajectory was set. Every choice, every sacrifice, every hour of practice, all in service of a dream that had never been hers. The accident had destroyed that dream, and Elena was beginning to realize the accident might have saved her life. This is the unlived life in its most tragic form, spending decades building toward something you never authentically wanted, never chose from your actual self, but inherited or absorbed or accepted because you didn't know how to access what you really wanted. Jung wrote, "The greatest tragedy of the family is the unlived lives of the parents." What he meant was that parents project their own unfulfilled dreams onto their children, and children absorb those dreams as their own, and the cycle continues, generation after generation living out someone else's unlived life instead of discovering their own. But it's not just parents. Culture projects dreams onto us. Society tells us what success looks like, what happiness requires, what paths are worth pursuing. And most of us absorb these dreams without question, without ever checking in with the deeper self to ask, is this what I actually want? Or is this what I've been taught to want? Elena spent the next 2 years in a process she called excavation, digging beneath the pianist identity to find what was underneath. It was terrifying work because it meant admitting that everything she'd achieved, everything she'd been proud of, might have been in service of a false dream. She started by giving herself permission to explore interests she'd always dismissed as impractical or irrelevant to her career. She took a pottery class. Something about working with her damaged hands in a new way felt important. She started hiking, discovering that physical movement in nature satisfied something piano practice never had. She volunteered at a women's shelter, and something about that work felt more meaningful than any performance. Slowly, carefully, Elena was discovering preferences she'd never known she had. Not preferences for how to be a better pianist, but preferences for how to be herself. What brought her joy? What felt like authentic engagement rather than obligation? By year 5, Elena was working as a trauma therapist, specializing in identity loss. She'd gone back to school, gotten her counseling degree, and found that her experience with losing her pianist identity made her uniquely equipped to help others through similar losses. She told me something that captures the essence of the unlived life revelation. The accident destroyed my dream, but it wasn't my dream. It was my parents' dream that I'd internalized so completely I couldn't tell the difference. I spent 24 years pursuing their unlived life. When I lost my hands, I didn't lose myself. I lost the performance I'd been giving, and underneath was this person I'd never met, with desires and interests and values that had nothing to do with piano. The accident didn't take my life. It gave me my life. For the first time ever, I'm living for me. Living for me. 3 words that represent a revolution in consciousness. Because here's what makes the unlived life so insidious. It doesn't feel false while you're living it. The borrowed dream feels like your dream. The inherited desires feel like your desires. You can spend decades, an entire lifetime, pursuing something with complete conviction, never realizing you've been reading from someone else's script. Until loss forces the question, was this ever mine? Jung developed a way of distinguishing between authentic calling and borrowed dreams. I want to share it with you because it might reveal something about what you lost, whether it was genuinely yours or something you'd absorbed without realizing it. The dream authenticity test. The solitude question. If you could pursue this dream in complete isolation, no recognition, no approval, no external validation, would you still want it? If the answer is no or uncertain, The dream might be more about validation than authentic desire. The origin question: when did you first want this? Was it your idea, or did someone plant it? Can you remember a moment of genuine choice, or did this path just seem inevitable? The energy question: when you're engaged in this pursuit, where does your energy come from? Internal satisfaction, or the anticipation of external reward? The former suggests authenticity, the latter suggests borrowed desire. The sacrifice question: what have you sacrificed for this dream? Do those sacrifices feel like devotion to something precious, or like payments on a debt you can't remember incurring? The alternative question: if this dream became impossible, would you experience it as liberation or devastation? Both emotions can be present, but which is stronger in your honest assessment? The projection question: who would be disappointed if you walked away from this dream? If the answer is primarily other people rather than yourself, the dream might not be yours. The body question: when you imagine achieving this dream, what does your body do? Expand with excitement or contract with tension? The body often knows what the mind won't admit. Take a moment with these questions. Think about the dream you were pursuing when loss intervened. Think about the life you were building, the identity you were crafting, the goal you were chasing. Run it through the test. You might discover something that feels like betrayal, that what you lost wasn't actually serving your authentic becoming, that you were on a path that would have led you further from yourself, not closer, that the loss, however painful, was a mercy. Let me be very clear about what I'm saying here, because it's easy to misinterpret this teachings, minimizing your loss or suggesting you should be grateful for devastation. I'm not saying your grief isn't real. I'm not saying loss is always liberation in disguise. What I'm saying is more nuanced. Sometimes we become so invested in false dreams that we can't recognize them as false. The investment itself, the time, energy, identity we've poured into the pursuit, makes us double down. We can't admit it's not our dream because we've already sacrificed too much for it. The sunk cost fallacy applies to entire lives, not just individual decisions, and in those cases, loss becomes the only intervention powerful enough to break the pattern. The universe, or the self, that deeper intelligence, looks at you pursuing someone else's dream and says, "No, that's not why you're here, and since you won't choose to walk away, I'm going to remove the option to continue." It's brutal. It feels like cruelty, but it's actually profound compassion, the kind of love that's willing to hurt you to save you from wasting your life. Elena's therapist introduced her to a concept that changed everything: the difference between ego desires and self-imperatives. Ego desires come from the external world, the need for approval, status, security, validation. They're reactive, constructed to meet others' expectations or avoid others' judgment. Self-imperatives come from deep within. They're the authentic callings, the true desires, the paths that align with your actual nature. The ego wants to be recognized as special. The self wants to become whole. The ego pursues dreams that prove your worth. The self pursues experiences that reveal your nature. The ego seeks validation through achievement. The self seeks integration through experience. Most of what we call ambition is ego desire. Most of what we call calling is self-imperative. And the tragedy is that ego desires are louder, more insistent, more validated by culture. Self-imperatives are quiet, easy to miss, often contradicting what you've been taught to want. Elena had been pursuing an ego desire, the need to be exceptional, to justify her parents' sacrifices, to prove she deserved all the attention and resources devoted to her development. It had masqueraded as love of music, as passion, as calling, but underneath was obligation, was performance, was the endless attempt to earn her right to exist, by being extraordinary. The self-imperative that emerged after her loss was entirely different: connection. Elena discovered she was deeply nourished by authentic human connection, by helping others through pain, by witnessing transformation. This desire wasn't about being special or recognized. It satisfied something more fundamental. It felt like coming home. When she finally accessed this self-imperative, Elena understood why the loss had been necessary. The pianist's dream had taken up so much space, so much time, energy, attention, that there was no room for the authentic calling to emerge. The accident had cleared the space, violently, painfully, but completely. This is the mercy hidden in loss. It destroys what was preventing your authentic becoming. It removes the false dream so the true one can finally surface. But, and this is crucial, this mercy only becomes visible in retrospect. In the moment of loss, it feels like pure destruction. There's no sense of mercy, no recognition of blessing in disguise. That interpretation is spiritual bypass if it comes too soon. You have to grieve the false dream fully before you can recognize it was false. Elena spent 3 years in genuine grief before the revelation came. 3 years of feeling like her life was over, like she'd lost her purpose, like everything she'd worked for had been for nothing. The grief was real and necessary. You cannot skip to "this was actually a gift" without first fully experiencing "this is devastating." Jung understood this. He never suggested that suffering was meaningful in some easy way. He suggested it could become meaningful through conscious work, through the alchemy of transformation, through the willingness to ask hard questions and face uncomfortable truths. So if you're in the acute phase of loss, if you're reading this and thinking, "But my loss isn't a liberation, it's agony," I hear you. I'm not asking you to reframe your pain as blessing. I'm asking you to consider, perhaps years from now, when the acute grief has subsided, whether what you lost might have been standing between you and your authentic life. Consider whether the dream you were pursuing was actually yours. Consider whether the path you were on was leading toward yourself or away from yourself. Consider whether the universe might have intervened not to punish you, but to save you from a life that would have remained forever unlived because you were too busy living someone else's version of it. Jung wrote something that feels almost cruel until you sit with it long enough to understand its wisdom. The greatest tragedy of the family is the unlived lives of the parents. But we could extend that. The greatest tragedy of any life is leaving it unlived. Not unfulfilled in the sense of not achieving enough, but unlived in the sense of never accessing your authentic desires, never discovering what you actually wanted beneath all the conditioning and expectation. Your loss might have been the only thing powerful enough to free you from that tragedy. Elena, 5 years after her accident, said something I want you to carry with you. "I used to think my life ended when I lost piano. Now I realize it began. The accident didn't take my life. It took the life I was supposed to live according to everyone else. And in the space where that false life used to be, my real life finally had room to grow." Your real life is trying to grow. It's been trying your whole life. But maybe what you loved, what you lost, was taking up all the room, all the light, all the soil. The loss cleared space. Now something else can grow. Not something better or worse than what you lost, but something more fundamentally yours. Something that doesn't require you to betray yourself to pursue it. Something that aligns with who you actually are beneath all the borrowed dreams. This is the unlived life wanting to be lived. This is your authentic self asking, now that the false dream is gone, can you finally hear me? Can you finally discover what I actually want? Can you finally become who I actually am? The answer to those questions, that's your becoming. That's what the loss was making space for. There's a particular kind of loss that tends to arrive like a sledgehammer around midlife, and it's different from the losses we've been exploring. It's not one thing ending, it's everything ending, simultaneously, as if the universe looked at the entire structure of your life and said, no, all of this needs to go now. Jung called this an individuation crisis, and he believed it was often necessary, even orchestrated by the unconscious, to force the ego into its next stage of development. Let me tell you about Thomas. Thomas was 45 when his life imploded. Not gradually, not one thing at a time, but all at once in a synchronized destruction that felt almost supernatural in its coordination. First, his wife of 18 years told him she'd been unhappy for a decade and wanted a divorce. 3 weeks later, the bank where he'd worked for 20 years restructured, and his position was eliminated. While he was reeling from both of those, he had a health scare, chest pains that turned out to be stress-induced, but required enough medical intervention to terrify him about his mortality. His father died during this period. His teenage daughter stopped speaking to him, angry about the divorce. In the span of 6 months, Thomas lost his marriage, his career, his health certainty, his father, and his relationship with his daughter. Every pillar of his identity collapsed at once. He told me later, it felt like the universe taking a sledgehammer to my ego, not targeting one thing, but systematically destroying everything I'd built my life on, everything I thought I was. For the first year, Thomas was in survival mode. Lawyers, job interviews, medical appointments, grief, chaos. He moved through it like a zombie, handling logistics while internally fragmenting. His friends worried he might not survive it psychologically. But then something strange began to happen in year 2. Thomas started to notice that without all the structures that had defined him, without the role of husband, executive, healthy person, son with living parents, connected father, he was discovering who he actually was underneath all those roles. And the person he discovered was radically different from the person he'd been performing as for decades. The executive persona had been authoritative, controlled, strategic. The real Thomas was contemplative, uncertain, more interested in questions than answers. The husband persona had been provider, problem solver, the strong one. The real Thomas was vulnerable, needed support, wanted emotional intimacy he'd never known how to ask for. By year 3, Thomas had built an entirely different life, not a rebuilt version of his old life, but something that felt like an alternative timeline, the life he might have lived if he'd been brave enough to choose himself at 25, instead of performing the version of himself that won approval. He'd started a small consulting practice that allowed him flexibility and autonomy, nothing like the corporate prestige he'd had, but infinitely more aligned with his actual values. He'd developed a meditation practice, something the old Thomas would have dismissed as woo-woo nonsense. He'd begun dating again, and the women he was drawn to were completely different from his ex-wife, not better or worse, but authentic matches rather than ego matches. Most significantly, his relationship with his daughter had transformed. When he stopped performing the strong, infallible father and started showing up as a real human being, vulnerable, struggling, imperfect, she'd gradually come back to him. She told him, "I hated the dad you were pretending to be, but I really like the person you actually are." Thomas described the entire experience as psychological death and rebirth. He said, "At 45, I died. Everything I thought I was, everything I'd built my identity around, all of it died. And for a long time, I was just this walking corpse going through the motions. But around year 2, something new started growing, something that had been buried my entire adult life. And by year 3, I realized I'm not recovering what I lost. I'm becoming someone I've never been. Someone I was maybe supposed to be all along, but didn't have the courage to become, until the universe forced me." This is what Jung meant by individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole, of integrating all the parts of yourself that have been suppressed or rejected, of evolving beyond the ego's limited self-concept into something larger and more authentic. And here's what Jung observed again and again. Individuation doesn't happen smoothly. It happens in crisis, particularly at major developmental thresholds. Adolescence, midlife, late life, when the psyche demands radical transformation and the ego resists. The ego wants stability, consistency, the known self. It's built an entire identity structure, and that structure feels like survival itself. Change feels like death because to the ego it is death, but the self, that deeper intelligence, that totality of psyche, is loyal to wholeness, not comfort. It's loyal to becoming, not maintaining. And when the gap between who you're capable of being and who you're actually being becomes too large, the self intervenes, sometimes gently through dreams, through intuition, through that persistent feeling that something's wrong, even when everything looks right on the surface. But if you don't listen to the gentle interventions, the self escalates. It creates circumstances. It orchestrates losses, not maliciously, not to punish, but with the surgical precision of a doctor who knows that the infection has spread too deep for anything but radical surgery. This is the disturbing truth about individuation crises. They're not random. They're not just bad luck or unfortunate timing. They're the self dismantling what the ego refuses to release, clearing space for the next stage of becoming. Let me map the typical stages of individuation and the losses that tend to accompany each stage, because recognizing the pattern can transform how you understand your own losses. Stage 1. Identity construction, roughly ages 20-35. This is when the ego builds its primary structures: career identity, relationship identity, social identity. You're answering the question, who am I? Primarily through external roles and achievements. The persona gets constructed and solidified. Typical losses at this stage: relationships that don't fit the identity you're constructing, opportunities that would threaten your trajectory, aspects of yourself that contradict the persona you're building. These losses usually feel like failures at the time: breakups, career setbacks, social rejection, but they're often the self preventing you from over-investing in structures that won't serve your long-term wholeness. Stage 2. Identity maintenance, roughly ages 35-45. This is when you're living inside the structures you built. You're the person you decided to be. You've achieved some version of success. From the outside, your life might look exactly how you planned it, but internally something starts to feel wrong. The role doesn't fit quite right anymore. The achievements don't satisfy like they used to. There's a persistent sense of, is this all there is? This is the self starting to agitate for change. But the ego is heavily invested now. It spent 15 years building this identity, and the sunk cost is enormous. So the ego digs in, suppresses the discomfort, tries harder to make the existing structures work. Typical losses at this stage: often none yet. This is the calm before the storm. But internally, the pressure is building. Stage 3. Individuation crisis, roughly ages 40-55. This is when the self's pressure reaches critical mass. The gap between who you're capable of being and who you're actually being becomes unsustainable. And if you haven't voluntarily begun the work of transformation, the self forces it. This is Thomas's sledgehammer moment. This is when the structures that seemed permanent suddenly collapse. Marriage ends. Career implodes. Health fails. Identity shatters. From the ego's perspective, this is catastrophic. From the self's perspective, this is necessary surgery. Typical losses at this stage: major identity pillars, relationship, career, health, status, often multiple losses occurring close. together or simultaneously. The losses feel coordinated because psychologically they are. The self is systematically dismantling what the ego won't voluntarily release. Stage 4, reconstruction, roughly ages 50-65. This is when you build a new life from the ruins of the old one. But here's what's different. You're not building from ego this time. You're building from self. You're constructing a life based on authentic values rather than external expectations, on internal alignment rather than external validation. This stage requires courage because the new life usually looks less impressive on paper than the old one. Less status, less certainty, less conventional success, but more authentic, more alive, more aligned. Typical losses at this stage: relationships and opportunities that don't fit the authentic self. But these losses feel different, more like pruning than amputation. You're consciously choosing what doesn't serve anymore rather than having it violently removed. Stage 5, integration, ages 65 plus. This is when you live as a relatively whole person, integrating all the parts you've reclaimed through the crisis. You're less identified with roles, more comfortable with uncertainty, more accepting of your full humanity, including your shadow. Typical losses at this stage: primarily physical losses, aging, death of peers, declining abilities. But if you've done the individuation work, these losses don't shatter your identity because you're no longer fused with external structures. Understanding these stages changes everything about how you interpret your losses. Because if Thomas's simultaneous implosion occurred at 45, that's not random timing, that's textbook individuation crisis. The self waited until the identity maintenance stage had fully run its course, then intervened with precision. Thomas's losses weren't punishment, they were invitation. The self was saying, "You've lived as the person you thought you should be for 25 years. That's enough. Now it's time to discover who you actually are." Let me share something personal here because I think vulnerability creates permission for your own honesty. I experienced my own individuation crisis at 42. For me, it wasn't simultaneous implosion, it was a cascading collapse over 18 months. First, a book project I'd spent 3 years on was rejected by every publisher. Then my primary relationship ended, not dramatically, but with the soul-crushing recognition that we'd been performing compatibility rather than living it. Then my father's dementia diagnosis, which forced me to confront his mortality and, by extension, my own. For a long time, I narrated these losses as bad luck, wrong timing, life being cruel. I was furious at the universe, at myself, at the randomness of suffering. But in year 2, in therapy, my analyst asked me the question that cracked everything open. What was possible in your life before these losses that you can't avoid anymore? Now? I sat with that question for weeks, and slowly the answer emerged. Before the losses, I could maintain the illusion that I was living authentically. The book project, the relationship, my role as dutiful son, they all allowed me to perform as a person who'd done the inner work, while actually avoiding the depths of that work. The book was more about what I thought would sell than what I actually needed to say. The relationship was more about not being alone than about genuine partnership. My role with my father was more about maintaining the fantasy of the strong, successful son than about real intimacy. The losses dismantled all 3 performances, and what emerged in the space they left was uncomfortable. Raw, but real. I started writing what I actually thought rather than what would be marketable. I stayed single long enough to discover I could be whole without a partner. I showed up to my father as I actually was, confused, scared, grieving, rather than as the son I thought he needed. Was it the worst 18 months of my life? Absolutely. Would I choose to go through it again? Never. But would I undo it if I could? knowing that doing so would mean remaining the person I was before the losses. No, because that person was a performance, and I'm tired of performing. That's what individuation crisis does. It exhausts you into authenticity. Jung wrote, "The afternoon of life is just as full of meaning as the morning, only its meaning and purpose are different." What he meant was that the first half of life is about building, ego, identity, achievement, security. The second half is about becoming, integrating shadow, accessing authentic self, preparing for wholeness, and the transition between these two phases is rarely smooth. It's usually catastrophic, because the skills that serve the first half of life actively hinder the second half. Achievement orientation becomes obstacle to self-acceptance. Persona construction becomes barrier to authentic expression. External validation becomes addiction that prevents internal authority. You can't enter the second half of life while clutching the tools and identities of the first half. Something has to die. Usually many things have to die, and the ego experiences this as loss, as tragedy, as everything going wrong. But the self experiences it as precisely what needs to happen, as the necessary death that precedes rebirth, as the shedding of skin that allows growth. This is why Thomas called it the universe taking a sledgehammer to my ego, because that's exactly what it was. Not the universe being cruel, but the self being ruthlessly committed to his becoming, so committed that it was willing to destroy every structure he'd built in the first half of life to make space for the authentic life of the second half. Let me give you a framework for recognizing whether your loss might be an individuation crisis. Signs. You're in individuation crisis, multiple losses occurring close together. The self tends to dismantle whole systems, not just individual pieces. Losses around developmental milestones, particularly ages 40, 55, but can occur earlier or later depending on your individual journey. Feeling that your entire identity is collapsing, not just grieving what you lost, but questioning who you are without it. Dreams of death, destruction, or transformation. The unconscious often previews or processes individuation through dream symbolism. Simultaneous pull toward something you can't name. Even in the devastation, there's a whisper of something else wanting to emerge. Previous life feeling increasingly empty before the losses. The self often creates internal pressure before external crisis. Sense that you can't go back, even if you could recover what was lost. Something in you knows you shouldn't. If several of these resonate, you're not just experiencing loss. You're experiencing transformation being forced upon you. The self has looked at your life and said, "This isn't it. We're starting over." And here's what makes this both terrifying and liberating. You cannot fail at individuation. You can resist it, delay it, make it more painful than necessary. But you cannot fail at it because the self is infinitely patient and infinitely committed. It will keep creating circumstances until you finally surrender to becoming. Thomas, 5 years after his sledgehammer moment, told me something that perfectly captures this. I spent the first 45 years of my life building a self I thought would keep me safe, would win approval, would prove I was worthy. The universe looked at what I'd built and said, "That's very nice, but it's not you. Let me show you what happens when all of that goes away." And what happened was, I didn't die. The performance died. The persona died. The false self died. But the actual me that had been buried under all that construction, I finally got to live. I finally got to live. Those words should haunt you, because how many years have you spent performing instead of living? How many decades have you given to constructing an identity that feels safe but isn't real? Your loss might be the self saying, "Enough. No more performance, no more false construction. It's time to live." Not the life you think you should want, not the life that would impress others, Not the life that maintains your current identity, but the life that's authentically yours. Messy, uncertain, probably less impressive on paper, but infinitely more real. Jung believed that the goal of the second half of life is to become conscious. Not successful, not comfortable, not validated. Conscious, aware of your whole self, including your shadow. Aligned with your authentic values rather than inherited ones. Living from self rather than ego. But you cannot become conscious while maintaining the unconscious structures of the first half of life. The ego's carefully constructed identity blocks access to consciousness because that identity is based on selective awareness, emphasizing some qualities, suppressing others, performing a partial self. Consciousness requires wholeness. Wholeness requires integration. Integration requires the death of the partial self. Your losses might be that death, the necessary death, the death that births consciousness. And if you're in the middle of that death right now, if you're reading this while everything you built is collapsing around you, I want you to hear something. You are not being destroyed. You are being liberated. The you that's dying isn't you. It's the costume, the performance, the ego's construction. The real you, the one that exists beneath all the roles and achievements and identities, that one can't die. That one is eternal, indestructible, patiently waiting for all the false structures to collapse so it can finally breathe. Your individuation crisis isn't the worst thing that's ever happened to you. It's the most important thing. It's the self's violent intervention to save you from wasting the second half of your life, maintaining the false self you constructed in the first half. Let it die. Let all of it die. The marriage that was performance, the career that was compensation, the identity that was costume, the version of yourself that exists to win approval. Let it die and discover what's been waiting underneath your entire life. That's your becoming. That's what the sledgehammer was making space for. And it begins with surrender, not to the loss, but to the transformation the loss is demanding. Now we need to talk about time, because everything I've shared so far, projection withdrawal, persona collapse, individuation crisis, all of it requires something our culture actively resists. The slow, patient, impossible to rush process of transformation through grief. We live in a world that wants healing to be quick. 3 steps to overcome loss. 5 strategies for moving on. 7 days to acceptance, as if grief were a problem to solve rather than an initiation to undergo. As if transformation could be microwaved rather than slow-cooked over years. Jung knew better. He studied medieval alchemy, not because he believed in turning lead into gold, literally, but because he recognized that the alchemists were describing psychological transformation in symbolic language. And what those alchemists understood, what Jung spent decades translating into modern psychology, was this. Real transformation takes time, devastating amounts of time, and it cannot be rushed without destroying the very thing you're trying to create. Let me introduce you to the alchemical framework Jung used to understand loss and transformation. There are 3 major stages, and I want to walk you through them, not as abstract concepts, but as lived experience, as the actual territory of grief you're moving through or will move through. Stage 1, Nigredo, the blackening. This is the death phase, the dissolution, the complete breakdown of everything that was. In alchemical texts, this is represented by images of decomposition, putrefaction, darkness, chaos. The prima materia, the raw material, has to be completely broken down before it can be reformed into something new. Psychologically, Nigredo is the acute grief phase. It's the space where everything feels dead, meaningless, destroyed. You can't imagine ever feeling okay again. You can't access hope. You can't see a future. You're in the underworld, and there's no light, and you're not sure there's a way out. Let me tell you about Maria. Maria's daughter Sophia died at 17 in a hiking accident, fell from a cliff, died instantly. Maria got the call while she was at work, teaching her high school English class. Her world ended in the space between one sentence and the next. The first 3 years were pure nigredo. Maria described it as living in a black hole. She went through the motions, continued teaching because she needed the income, showed up to family events because people expected her to, pretended to be functional while internally fragmenting. But inside, she was dissolving. Her identity as Sophia's mother, which had been central to who she was dying. Her belief in a benevolent universe was dying. Her capacity to feel anything except pain was dying. Even her sense of self was dying because the self she'd been included Sophia's existence, and now Sophia was gone. Maria told me that during nigredo, well-meaning people would say things like, "She's in a better place," or "Time heals all wounds," or "You need to find closure." And every platitude felt like violence, because nigredo doesn't want comfort, it wants acknowledgement, it wants permission to be in the darkness without having to pretend it's anything but dark. In alchemical terms, you cannot rush nigredo. The prima materia must completely dissolve. All the structures, all the certainties, all the ways you understood yourself and the world, they have to break down entirely. If you try to skip this phase, if you try to force meaning or growth or silver linings too early, you're attempting to build on ground that hasn't been cleared. The foundation will be false, and eventually it will collapse. Maria spent 3 years in nigredo, 3 years of darkness, of feeling dead while still alive, of going through life as a ghost. Her therapist didn't try to speed her through it, didn't offer strategies for moving on, just sat with her in the darkness and bore witness. Year 3, something shifted, not dramatically, not suddenly, but subtly. Maria noticed she could sometimes go an hour without thinking about Sophia's death. Then, an afternoon, she started having dreams that weren't nightmares. She found herself drawn to things, poetry, gardening, long walks, not as distraction but as genuine interest. She was entering albedo. Stage 2, albedo, the whitening. This is the purification phase. In alchemy, after the blackening comes a washing, a cleansing, a gradual lightening. The dissolved material starts to take on new form, but it's still fragile, still unclear, still in process. Psychologically, albedo is when you start to emerge from the depths of grief. You're not healed, healing is the wrong word, but you're beginning to integrate the loss. You're learning to carry it rather than being crushed by it. You're starting to access meaning, not as a way to bypass the pain, but as a way to live with it. For Maria, year 4 through year 6 were albedo. She started attending a grief support group, not because anyone told her to, but because she felt ready. She began journaling, processing not just Sophia's death, but her own relationship with loss, with motherhood, with identity. She explored spiritual questions she'd never considered before. What happens after death? What is the soul? What is the relationship between the living and the dead? These weren't academic questions, they were survival questions, ways of constructing a framework that could hold both Sophia's absence and Maria's continued existence. Albedo is when you start to find language for what happened, not language that explains it or justifies it or makes it okay, but language that allows you to carry it consciously rather than being unconsciously consumed by it. Maria wrote poetry about Sophia. She created a small garden in her daughter's memory. She started talking to Sophia in her mind, not in a delusional way, but as a practice of continuing connection. She was beginning to understand that Sophia's physical death didn't have to mean total absence, that some form of relationship could continue, transformed but real. This is the slow work of albedo, washing away what's no longer needed, clarifying what remains, gradually allowing new form to emerge from the dissolved material. It's still painful, you're still grieving, but there's space now for other things too. Small joys, moments of peace, glimpses of meaning. Albedo can last for years. Maria's lasted 3, and even as she moved through it, there were still days that felt like Negredo again. Sudden plunges back into darkness triggered by Sophia's birthday or a memory or just random waves of grief. Transformation isn't linear. It spirals, circles back, revisits what you thought you'd processed. But overall, the trajectory was toward lightening, toward integration, toward being able to hold both the loss and the life that continues after loss. And then, around year 7, Maria entered rubedo. Stage 3, rubedo, the reddening. This is the integration phase. In alchemy, rubedo represents the final transformation, the creation of the philosopher's stone, the transmutation of base material into gold. The dissolved and purified material is now reformed into something new, something that contains all that came before but is fundamentally transformed. Psychologically, rubedo is when your loss becomes integrated into your identity in a way that serves both you and others. You don't forget what you lost. You don't get over it, but you metabolize it. You transform it from pure pain into something that has meaning, purpose, medicine. For Maria, rubedo meant becoming a grief counselor. Not immediately. It took 2 more years of training, of ensuring she was doing this from wholeness rather than from wound. But by year 9 after Sophia's death, Maria was working with other parents who'd lost children. She told me, Sophia's death destroyed me, but it also created me. Not created the teacher or mother I was before. That person died with her. It created someone new, someone who can sit with others in their darkest darkness and not try to fix them or rush them or offer false comfort. Someone who knows that grief is not a problem to solve, but an initiation to undergo. Sophia's death is the worst thing that ever happened to me. It's also what made me capable of my life's real work. This is rubedo. This is the gold hidden in the blackening, not the stupid, insulting suggestion that loss is a blessing in disguise, not the toxic positivity that tries to force meaning onto suffering, but the earned wisdom that suffering, when fully felt and consciously processed over years, can become medicine. The alchemists had a saying, solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. First, everything must be dissolved, negredo. Then, gradually, it coagulates into new form, albedo. Finally, it's transformed into something that contains all that was lost, but is fundamentally new, rubedo. You cannot skip negredo. You cannot rush albedo. You cannot force rubedo. Each stage has its own timeline, its own requirements, its own necessary suffering and slow transformation. Maria's process took 9 years. 9 years from Sophia's death to becoming a grief counselor. And even now, 16 years later, she'll tell you she's still in process, still discovering new layers of meaning, still grieving in ways that surprise her, still being transformed by a loss that occurred nearly 2 decades ago. Because here's what our quick-fix culture doesn't want you to know. Transformation through loss is not a destination you arrive at. It's a continuous process. You don't complete your grief work and move on. You metabolize loss over the course of your entire remaining life. And each stage of life brings new understanding, new integration, new ways of carrying what you lost. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." He wasn't being dramatic or pessimistic. He was stating a fact about how transformation works. Consciousness, real awareness, real integration, real wholeness requires experiencing and processing pain, not bypassing it, not medicating it away, not pretending it's something other than what it is. The alchemists understood this at a level modern psychology is only beginning to recover. They knew that you cannot create gold without first destroying the original material. That destruction is part of creation. That death is part of transformation. Let me give you the alchemical grief map, a way of tracking your own transformation through loss. This isn't about rushing yourself through stages or checking boxes. It's about recognizing where you are, honoring what that stage requires, and trusting that you're in a process, even when you can't see its direction. The alchemical grief map. Negredo indicators. Everything feels meaningless and dark. You're going through motions but feel dead inside. You can't imagine ever feeling okay again. Attempts at comfort or meaning feel like insults. You're dissolving, identity, beliefs, sense of self, all fragmenting. Time feels distorted. Days blur together, or each moment is excruciating. You're in the underworld with no visible exit. What Negredo requires: permission to be in darkness without pretending otherwise. Witnesses who can sit with your pain without trying to fix it. Basic survival, eating, sleeping, functioning at minimum level. No pressure to find meaning or silver linings. Acknowledgement that your world has ended. Time, often measured in years, not weeks. Albedo indicators, occasional moments of lightness or interest. Beginning to ask spiritual or philosophical questions. Able to talk about loss without total collapse. Starting to construct frameworks that can hold the paradox. Seeking connection with others who understand dreams, or symbols emerging that feel meaningful. Small rituals or practices that bring comfort. What albedo requires: continued grief work, therapy, groups, journaling, art, patience with the non-linear nature of healing, exploration of meaning without forcing conclusions, connection with others in similar process, spiritual or philosophical frameworks, if they serve you, creative expression of your experience. Time, often several more years. Rubedo indicators, loss integrated into identity rather than consuming identity. Able to help others through similar loss. Sense of purpose emerging from the experience. Wisdom rather than just wound, both and thinking. It was devastating and meaningful. Changed values, priorities, way of being in the world. Grief still present but not destabilizing. What Rubedo requires: continued integration. This isn't done. Sharing your medicine with others when ready. Honoring that transformation is ongoing. Avoiding the trap of making loss your only identity, both remembering and living forward. Wisdom that serves without creating superiority time the rest of your life. Look at where you are in this map. Don't judge it. Don't try to rush it. Just recognize you're in an alchemical process. The darkness you're experiencing isn't failure, it's Negredo. The confusion and seeking you're feeling isn't weakness, it's albedo. The meaning starting to emerge isn't betrayal of what you lost, it's rubedo. And all of it takes time. Devastating, excruciating, impossible to rush time. Maria told me something that I think you need to hear. Our culture wants grief to be efficient. 3 months, maybe 6, then you should be back to normal. But there is no back to normal when you've lost what I lost. There's only through years of darkness, through years of confusion, through years of slowly, painfully becoming someone new. And anyone who tells you it should be faster is someone who hasn't actually been to the underworld. Through years of slowly, painfully becoming someone new. That's the alchemical process. That's the transformation loss demands. And here's the secret the alchemists knew. The gold you create in rubedo is worth more than what you started with in negredo. Not because loss is good or because suffering is noble, but because conscious transformation of pain creates a form of wisdom and wholeness that cannot be accessed any other way. Before Sophia's death, Maria was a good English teacher. After Sophia's death, after 9 years of alchemical transformation, Maria became someone who could hold space for the deepest human suffering without flinching, someone who could sit with parents in their darkest hour and offer not platitudes but presence, someone who'd been to the underworld and returned with medicine. The gold isn't happiness, it isn't closure, it isn't getting over it. The gold is who you become through the process of metabolizing loss. It's the depth, the wisdom, the capacity to hold both suffering and beauty, both grief and joy, both death and life. Jung spent years studying alchemy because he recognized that the alchemists were describing the individuation process in symbolic language. The prima materia, the raw material that must be broken down, is the ego's constructed identity. Nigredo is ego death. Albedo is the purification of consciousness. Rubedo is the integration of self, the philosopher's stone, the indestructible core that emerges from the dissolution of everything false. Your loss is your prima materia, the raw material of transformation. It's being dissolved in Nigredo, purified in Albedo, integrated in Rubedo, and the gold being created isn't a different you, it's the real you, the essential you, the you that was always there but couldn't emerge while you were clutching your old identity. But you have to let the process work. You have to stay in Nigredo long enough for the dissolution to complete. You have to do the slow work of Albedo without rushing to conclusions. You have to allow Rubedo to emerge naturally, rather than forcing meaning prematurely. This is where most people fail at transformation, not because they're not strong enough or smart enough, but because they won't give it time. They try to speed through Nigredo because darkness is uncomfortable. They try to skip Albedo because uncertainty is frightening. They try to force Rubedo because they want the gold without the fire. But alchemy doesn't work that way. Transformation doesn't work that way. You cannot microwave what needs to slow cook for years. Maria's 9-year process might sound like an eternity to you. You might be thinking, I can't survive 9 years of this. But here's what you need to understand. You're not surviving 9 years of acute pain. You're moving through stages that each feel different, each require different things, each bring their own form of movement forward. Nigredo is excruciating, but it doesn't last forever. Albedo is confusing, but it's lighter than Nigredo. Rubedo is still grief, but it's grief that coexists with meaning. The process is long, but it's not static. You're moving, even when you can't feel it. And here's the brutal truth. You don't have a choice about whether to go through this process. Loss has already initiated you. The only choice you have is whether to do it consciously or unconsciously, whether to honor each stage or try to bypass it, whether to allow the transformation or resist it. If you try to bypass Nigredo through substances, through frantic activity, through immediate replacement of what you lost, through spiritual bypass, you're just delaying the inevitable. The dissolution will happen anyway, but unconsciously, and it will take longer and be more destructive. If you try to rush Albedo through premature meaning-making, through forced optimism, through everything happens for a reason platitudes, you're building on ground that hasn't been cleared. The foundation will be false and it will collapse later. If you try to force Rubedo through making your loss your entire identity, through claiming wisdom you haven't earned, through using your suffering as currency or status, you're creating fool's gold, not real gold. It looks shiny but has no substance. The only way through is through, slowly, patiently, with respect for the timeline the process requires. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But that becoming, when it happens through loss, requires time that feels like lifetimes, requires patience that feels impossible, requires trust in a process you can't see or control." Maria, 16 years after Sophia's death, said something that perfectly captures the alchemical view of loss. "I used to think grief was something to get through, to overcome, to complete. Now I understand it's something to metabolize, to transform, to carry consciously, rather than being unconsciously carried by it. Sophia's death will be part of me until I die. But it's not just pain anymore, it's also wisdom. It's also medicine. It's also what made me capable of my real work. The gold didn't replace the lead. The gold is the lead, transformed through fire. The gold is the lead, transformed through fire. That's alchemy. That's what loss does when you give it time and consciousness and the respect the process demands. You are in the fire right now. You are the prima materia being dissolved, purified, reformed. It feels like destruction because in part it is destruction, but it's also creation. It's also transformation. It's also the slow, impossible to rush work of becoming who you actually are underneath who you were. Trust the process. Honor the timeline. Stay in the fire as long as it takes. Because what's being created, the gold of your becoming, is worth every excruciating moment of the alchemical work. Now, we need to explore something that will fundamentally shift how you understand not just your loss, but your entire life. This is where Jung's psychology becomes almost oracular, where the boundary between psychology and spirituality dissolves, where you start to recognize that there's an intelligence operating in your life that's far wiser than your conscious ego. What I'm about to share will sound impossible, perhaps even offensive, until you've experienced it enough times to recognize the pattern. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. Your losses aren't random. They're communications, messages from the deeper intelligence Jung called the self, trying to guide your life when your ego won't listen. Let me explain what the self is, because this concept is central to understanding loss as language. Jung distinguished between the ego and the self. The ego is your conscious identity, the I you experience, the one making decisions, the one reading these words right now. It's necessary, important, but fundamentally limited. The ego knows only what consciousness reveals. It operates with partial information, seeing through a narrow lens. The self, in contrast, is the totality of your psyche, conscious and unconscious, known and unknown, lived and unlived. It's the deep intelligence that knows things your ego doesn't know. It holds your potential, your destiny, your authentic path. It sees your entire life from a perspective the ego cannot access. Think of it like this. The ego is the driver of a car, focused on the road immediately ahead, making moment-to-moment decisions. The self is like having a GPS with a view of the entire map, knowing not just where you are, but where you're going, seeing obstacles ahead that the driver can't yet perceive. And here's what Jung discovered. When the ego's choices diverge too far from the self's knowing, when you're heading in a direction that's wrong for your authentic becoming, the self intervenes. It sends signals, dreams, intuitions, that persistent feeling that something's off, even when everything looks fine. But if the ego ignores these gentle signals, the self escalates. It creates circumstances. It orchestrates events. It uses the unconscious's vast power to redirect your life, sometimes gently, sometimes with the force of a freight train. Loss is often that intervention. Let me tell you about James. James was a journalist, brilliant, successful, winning awards for investigative reporting at major publications. By age 35, he'd achieved everything he'd set out to achieve. He was respected, well paid, doing work that mattered, except he wasn't. Not really. James kept getting fired, not for incompetence. His work was excellent, not for ethical violations. He was scrupulous. He'd work at a prestigious publication for 2 or 3 years, do brilliant work, and then something would happen. A restructuring, a conflict with an editor, a piece that somehow crossed a line he didn't see until it was too late. 6 major publications in 10 years. Each time James would be devastated, confused. Each time he'd land another prestigious job, and each time after a year or two of success, something would go wrong and he'd be out again. His friends said he had bad luck. His therapist initially thought it was self-sabotage from low self-worth. But neither explanation felt right to James. He didn't feel unlucky. He didn't hate himself. He was genuinely trying to succeed, and in many ways, he was succeeding until he wasn't. In therapy, James started exploring not just why he was getting fired, but what pattern might be operating beneath the surface. His therapist asked, "What's consistent across all these jobs? Not the surface details, but the deeper structure?" James thought about it for weeks. Then, finally, "I always start excited about a publication's mission, but within a year I start noticing the compromises, the stories we don't pursue because they'd upset advertisers, the editorial slant that serves the ownership's politics, the slow corruption of the journalism I believed in. And then I start to, I don't know, test the boundaries, push harder, write what needs to be written regardless of whether it's commercially viable. And that's when things start to go wrong." His therapist leaned forward. "What if you're not getting fired? What if some part of you is choosing to leave once you've recognized that the publication violates your values?" James sat with that for a long moment. "But I'm not choosing to leave. I'm trying to make it work." "Your ego is trying to make it work. But what if your unconscious, yourself, is sabotaging situations that betray your authentic values? What if it's protecting you from wasting your life in service of institutions that contradict what you actually believe?" This reframe changed everything for James. He started reviewing each firing not as failure, but as message. What was his unconscious trying to tell him by creating circumstances that forced him out? The pattern became clear. Every publication he'd worked for looked good on the surface, prestigious, respected, doing important work. But beneath that surface, each one compromised the values James held most sacred: truth, integrity, speaking power to accountability. And once his unconscious recognized the compromise, it began creating circumstances that would force him out. An email sent to the wrong person, a source relationship that became too controversial, a piece that was brilliant but politically untenable. His therapist suggested these weren't accidents or bad luck. They were the unconscious using mistakes to serve James's authentic path. The self was trying to redirect him away from mainstream journalism and toward something more, aligned with his actual values. But James's ego kept fighting it, kept trying to make conventional success work, kept believing he should be able to thrive in institutions, even when those institutions violated his deepest principles. The firings were the self saying, "No, that's not your path. Stop trying to force yourself into structures that require you to compromise your soul. I'll keep creating circumstances that force you out until you finally listen." James finally listened. He left mainstream journalism and started his own independent publication. Smaller, less prestigious, financially uncertain, but completely aligned with his values. No advertisers to appease, no corporate ownership to serve, no editorial compromises. He's been running it for 8 years now. Not once has he experienced the sabotage pattern that plagued his career before, because now his ego's choices and his self's knowing are aligned. This is what I mean by loss as language. James's repeated job losses weren't random. They were communications. The self was speaking, and the language it was using was circumstance. Each firing was a sentence in a message that read, "This path is wrong for you. I'll keep removing you from it until you choose differently." Most people never learn to read this language. They experience loss after loss and interpret it as bad luck, as personal failure, as proof that life is cruel. They never ask, what if there's a pattern? What if there's intelligence operating? What if my losses are trying to tell me something? Jung wrote, Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Read that again, because what he's saying is, your unconscious is already directing your life. The question is whether you're doing it consciously, with awareness, with participation, or unconsciously, experiencing your own psyche's interventions as external fate. When you experience loss, especially repeated losses, in a particular area of your life, the question isn't, why is this happening to me? The question is, what is this trying to tell me? Let me give you the loss as language framework, a way of decoding what your unconscious might be trying to communicate. The loss as language framework. 1. Pattern recognition. Look for patterns across multiple losses. Do they occur in similar life areas? Relationships, career, health, location. Do they share timing, always around certain ages, seasons, life transitions? Do they share themes? Always losing what you've worked hardest for, always losing what feels most secure, always losing what others envy. Patterns reveal that something systematic is operating, not just random misfortune. 2. Timing analysis. When do your losses occur? Right when things look most successful. Self-disrupting false success. When you're about to make a major commitment. Self-preventing wrong path. At developmental thresholds. Individuation crisis forcing growth. When you're ignoring internal warning signs. Self-escalating from subtle to obvious. Timing often reveals whether the self is preventing something, pushing you towards something, or forcing a necessary developmental transition. 3. What specifically was taken? Not all losses are equal. What exactly did you lose? A relationship that was codependent, self-forcing independence, a career that looked good but felt empty, self-demanding authenticity, a dream that wasn't really yours, self-clearing false paths, security that kept you from risk, self-forcing growth beyond comfort. The specific nature of the loss often reveals what needed to be removed. 4. What becomes possible? After, what can you do now that wasn't possible before the loss? Geographic freedom. Someone keeping you tied to a location is gone. Identity exploration. Role that defined you is gone. Authentic expression. Someone you were performing for is gone. Values alignment. Situation requiring compromise is gone. What becomes possible often reveals what the self was making space for. 5. What you can no longer avoid. Loss removes options. What are you forced to face now? Your own company. Relationship that distracted you is gone. Your authentic values. Career that contradicted them is gone. Your mortality, health certainty is gone. Your shadow, projection screen is gone. What you can no longer avoid often reveals what you've been avoiding. What the self is demanding you finally confront. 6. Recurring dreams or symbols. Pay attention to your dream life around losses. Are there recurring images? Death, water, fire, falling, flying. Are there symbols that feel significant? Animals, buildings, people. Do dreams preview or process the loss? The unconscious often speaks more clearly in dreams than in waking life, using symbols to communicate what language cannot. There is a moment in every life when the world you thought was solid reveals itself as mist. You reach for what you held most dear, the person, the dream, the identity you wrapped around yourself like armor, and your hand closes on nothing. The absence is so complete, so violent in its silence, that you cannot recognize yourself in the mirror anymore. This is not mere sadness, this is obliteration. This is the ego's crucifixion, and you are nailed to it, gasping, unable to comprehend why the universe would be so cruel as to take from you the very thing that made existence bearable. But what if I told you that this devastation, this complete unraveling of everything you believed yourself to be, was not cruelty at all? What if the loss that brought you to your knees was actually the first honest moment of your entire life? Jung understood something that our modern world desperately tries to avoid, that we build our identities on sand. We construct elaborate fortresses of meaning around external things, relationships, achievements, possessions, roles, and we call this fortress myself. We say, I am a spouse, I am successful, I am loved, I am defined by this person who sees me. The ego, that fragile guardian of our daily consciousness, clings to these definitions with white-knuckled desperation because without them, it fears it will cease to exist. And so we mistake the fortress for the foundation. We confuse what we possess with who we are. The beloved, whether person, dream, or cherished identity, becomes the final proof of our worthiness. Through their eyes, we see ourselves as real. Through their presence, we feel substantial. We project onto them all the unlived potential within us, all the qualities we've failed to recognize in ourselves. They become the carrier of our gold, the mirror in which we finally appear valuable. And then, one day, the mirror shatters. Loss arrives like a thief in the night, but it steals nothing that was ever truly yours. This is the terrible, liberating truth that the ego cannot bear to hear. What you possessed was never possession. It was always a threshold, a doorway, a temporary dwelling place for something the universe was trying to teach you about yourself. The person you loved, the dream you cherished, the identity you wore, these were not the destination. They were the sacred mirror reflecting back the fragments of your own unlived self, the parts of you that you had exiled into projection because you could not yet hold them consciously. When that mirror breaks, when absence replaces presence with such totality that you can barely breathe, you are experiencing what the alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the necessary rot that precedes all transformation. The mystery schools of ancient Greece knew this. The shamanic traditions understood it. Initiation always requires a death, not physical death, but something far more terrifying to the ego, the death of who you thought you were. Grief, then, is not simply an emotional response to loss. It is an initiation ritual, a forced descent into the underworld of your own psyche. You are being stripped, layer by layer, the personas you've worn, the masks that helped you navigate the world, the false selves you constructed to earn love, to feel safe, to belong, are being torn away. And beneath those layers, there is a void, a terrible, howling emptiness where your certainty used to live. This is the ego's nightmare. This is the moment when everything you used to say about yourself stops making sense. But Jung would ask you to look more closely at what is actually dying. Is it you? Or is it the illusion of you, the constructed self that depended on external validation, on possession, on control, on the fantasy that permanence was ever possible in a universe defined by flux? The beloved was never meant to complete you. That is the shadow side of attachment, the unexamined truth we bury beneath romance and need. We love, yes, but beneath that love often lurks a desperate grasping, a hidden belief that this person, this thing, this circumstance will finally make us whole. We use love as a defense against the terror of our own incompleteness. We cling to relationships not as celebrations of two whole beings meeting, but as contracts. Prove to me that I am enough. Reflect back to me the value I cannot find in myself. And so the loss becomes unbearable, not only because we miss the beloved, but because we are forced to confront what their presence was masking, our own refusal to become. We outsourced our wholeness. We made them responsible for the very sense of meaning that only we can generate from within. Now they are gone, and we are left facing the emptiness we've been running from our entire lives. This is enantiodromia, Jung's principle that everything eventually transforms into its opposite. The very thing that brought you joy becomes the source of devastation. Presence becomes absence. Love reveals itself as attachment, as grasping, as a beautiful prison you didn't know you were constructing. The loss exposes the illusion. You never possessed them, and they never possessed you. All along, you were two separate beings, and what you called love was often projection, need, the ego's attempt to avoid its own dissolution. But here, in this unbearable moment of complete shattering, something is trying to be born. The wound is not punishment, it is an opening. The ego's death is the self's invitation. You are being initiated into a mystery that cannot be learned any other way, that your wholeness was never dependent on anything outside yourself, that the gold you saw in the beloved was always your own gold, reflected back to you, waiting to be reclaimed. You cannot see this yet. Right now you are in the tomb, in the darkness, in the breaking. Right now every breath feels like betrayal because they are not here to witness it. Right now you would give anything to return to the illusion, to the comfortable prison of your old identity, to the safety of not knowing what you now cannot unknow. But you cannot go back. The initiation has begun. The old self is dying, and it must die completely before the authentic self can emerge. This is not cruelty. This is the universe refusing to let you settle for the small story you were telling yourself about who you are. This is love, terrible, uncompromising love, forcing you to release your grip on the false so that you might finally hold the true. The beloved was not your destination. They were your catalyst, your mirror, your threshold. And their loss, this unbearable, devastating loss, is the doorway to your becoming. You stand at the edge of it now, stripped bare, ego shattered, fortress collapsed. You do not yet know what lies on the other side. You only know that you cannot remain who you were, and that, though you cannot feel it yet, is exactly where your transformation begins. Something strange begins to happen in the aftermath of devastation. At first, you do not notice it. You are too busy surviving, too occupied with the simple mechanics of continuing, breathing, eating, moving through days that feel like walking underwater. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, something shifts. The void that once threatened to swallow you whole begins to feel less like an abyss and more like a clearing. The silence that screamed with absence starts to hum with a different quality. Not emptiness, but spaciousness. You are still broken, yes, but now in the cracks, light is getting in. This is the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the psyche's natural movement toward wholeness. And here is the profound paradox. You could not have reached this place without first being shattered. The ego had to collapse because the ego, by its very nature, cannot individuate. It can only defend, only grasp, only cling to the known and the controlled. The self, that deeper, truer center of your being, could only emerge once the ego's tyranny was broken. Loss was not your enemy. It was the surgeon cutting away the false growth so that authentic life could finally flourish. You begin to notice things you could not see before. Qualities you admired in the beloved, their courage, their creativity, their capacity for joy, you start to recognize as reflections of your own unlived potential. What you loved in them was always a part of you, projected outward because you had not yet claimed it as your own. The alchemists understood this. The gold we see in others is often the gold we have buried within ourselves, hidden beneath layers of fear and unworthiness. When we lose the beloved, we are forced to mine our own depths. We must become the very qualities we once sought in another. This is the work of reclamation, and it is anything but easy. It requires you to sit with the discomfort of owning your power, your beauty, your capacity for meaning-making without outsourcing it to someone else. It demands that you face the parts of yourself you exiled into shadow, The needs you labeled as weakness, the desires you deemed unacceptable, the rage and grief and wild authenticity you suppressed in order to be loved. All of it must be integrated now. All of it must be brought home. Jung spoke of the transcendent function, the psyche's inherent ability to hold tension between opposites and birth something new from that friction. In the crucible of your grief, two truths are colliding: the truth of unbearable loss and the truth of unexpected growth. You loved them and you miss them still, and yet you are becoming someone you could never have become if they had stayed. Both are true. Both are sacred. The transcendent function does not resolve this paradox by choosing one truth over the other. It holds both, and in that holding, a third thing emerges: wisdom, depth, a self that is no longer fragmented, but beginning to cohere around a center that is genuinely, irreducibly yours. This is the alchemical albedo, the whitening that follows the blackness of nigredo. Clarity arrives. The fog of projection begins to lift. You see the beloved not as they existed in your fantasy, but as they actually were: flawed, complex, human, separate. And in seeing them clearly, you see yourself clearly for the first time. You were never defined by their presence or their absence. You were always whole, always enough, always complete unto yourself. The relationship was a mirror, a teacher, a catalyst, but it was never your source. And then comes the rubedo, the reddening, the return of vital life force. You feel it first as small flickers, a moment of genuine laughter, a spark of curiosity, a sudden awareness of beauty that has nothing to do with the past. Your aliveness is returning, but it is different now. It is not the naive innocence of before, the unconscious happiness that depended on external circumstances. This is hard-won vitality, forged in the fire of loss and tempered by grief. It is the aliveness of someone who has died and returned, who knows the fragility of all things and chooses to live fully anyway. The phoenix burns not once but endlessly, dying and rising in cycles throughout its existence. This is the truth of individuation. It is not a destination, but a process, a continual death and rebirth as you shed old skins and grow into larger versions of yourself. Loss was one such burning. There will be others. But now you know the secret. What burns away was never truly you. It was only what you mistook for yourself. The essence, the self at the core of your being, cannot be destroyed. It can only be revealed again and again through each successive stripping away of what is false. You begin to relate differently to the world now, where once you sought relationships to complete you, to validate you, to prove your worthiness. You now approach connection from a place of wholeness. This is the shift from possessive love to authentic love, from needing another person to fill your emptiness, to meeting them as a full being, meeting another full being. There is grief in this too. Authentic love does not promise permanence or security or the fantasy of merging into one. It honors separateness. It accepts impermanence. It loves without grasping, holds without clinging, cherishes without demanding that the beloved remain unchanged or present forever. This is what the loss taught you, though the lesson was brutal beyond measure. You learned that nothing belongs to you, not people, not circumstances, not even your own identity. Everything is borrowed, everything is in flux. Everything will eventually be taken or will leave of its own accord. And paradoxically, this knowledge does not make love less precious. It makes it infinitely more so. You love now with the full awareness of loss, which means you love with your whole heart and no illusions. This is mature love. This is the love that can only emerge after innocence has been shattered. The void left by loss, you discover, was never empty. It was pregnant with possibility. In the space where the beloved used to be, You found room to grow into yourself. The hours you once spent in their presence, you now spend in your own company, and slowly, tentatively, you begin to realize that you are not bad company. The dreams you deferred, the passions you ignored, the parts of yourself you made small to fit into the relationship, all of this can now unfold. You are not being compensated for loss. You are being completed by it. Jung wrote that we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Your loss dragged you into darkness, yes, but in that darkness you met parts of yourself you had been avoiding your entire life. You met your capacity to survive what you thought would destroy you. You met your resilience, your depth, your ability to hold complexity and paradox. You met the self that exists beneath all roles, all relationships, all external definitions, the self that simply is, regardless of circumstances. This is individuation's acceleration. Loss does not slow the process of becoming. It speeds it up exponentially. What might have taken decades of comfortable incremental growth happens in the compressed crucible of grief. You are forced to confront questions that most people spend their lives avoiding. Who am I when everything is stripped away? What defines me when all external markers of identity are gone? Can I stand alone, unsupported by another's gaze, and still know myself as real, as valuable as enough? The answer that emerges from the ruins is not a thought but a felt sense, a bone-deep knowing. Yes, you can. You are. The beloved was never meant to complete you because you were never incomplete. You were always whole, but you needed the shattering to remember it. You needed to lose everything to discover that you could not be lost. The self that remains after ego death, the self with a capital S in Jung's language, is indestructible. It existed before the beloved, it exists after them, and it will exist through every future loss and every future becoming. This does not mean you stop missing them. Grief and growth are not mutually exclusive. You can honor what was while stepping fully into what is. You can hold gratitude for the catalyst while releasing the fantasy that they were meant to stay forever. You can love them still, differently now, without need or grasping, while also loving yourself enough to continue becoming. The universe did not take from you to punish you. It took from you to free you from illusion, from false identity, from the small story you were telling yourself about what was possible. Loss was the only force powerful enough to break open the chrysalis you had been living inside, the only catalyst that could shove you, screaming and resisting, into the fullness of your own becoming. You stand now in a different place, not healed, perhaps, not if healing means returning to who you were before. You can never return, but whole in a way you were not whole before, even when you had everything. Whole because you have reclaimed the projections, whole because you have integrated the shadow, whole because you have discovered that your center, your true center, was never outside yourself. Loss was never your ending, it was always your beginning, and the self that emerges from these ashes, scarred and luminous, is the self you were always meant to become. Head, making moment-to-moment decisions. The self is like having a GPS with a view of the entire map, knowing not just where you are, but where you're going, seeing obstacles ahead that the driver can't yet perceive. And here's what Jung discovered. When the ego's choices diverge too far from the self's knowing, when you're heading in a direction that's wrong for your authentic becoming, the self intervenes. It sends signals, dreams, intuitions, that persistent feeling that something's off, even when everything looks fine. But if the ego ignores these gentle signals, the self escalates. It creates circumstances. It orchestrates events. It uses the unconscious's vast power to redirect your life, sometimes gently, sometimes with the force of a freight train. Loss is often that intervention. Let me tell you about James. James was a journalist, brilliant, successful, winning awards for investigative reporting at major publications. By age 35, he'd achieved everything he'd set out to achieve. He was respected, well paid, doing work that mattered, except he wasn't. Not really. James kept getting fired, not for incompetence. His work was excellent, not for ethical violations. He was scrupulous. He'd work at a prestigious publication for 2 or 3 years, do brilliant work, and then something would happen. A restructuring, a conflict with an editor, a piece that somehow crossed a line he didn't see until it was too late. 6 major publications in 10 years. Each time James would be devastated, confused. Each time he'd land another prestigious job, and each time after a year or 2 of success, something would go wrong and he'd be out again. His friends said he had bad luck. His therapist initially thought it was self-sabotage from low self-worth. But neither explanation felt right to James. He didn't feel unlucky. He didn't hate himself. He was genuinely trying to succeed, and in many ways, he was succeeding until he wasn't. In therapy, James started exploring not just why he was getting fired, but what pattern might be operating beneath the surface. His therapist asked, "What's consistent across all these jobs? Not the surface details, but the deeper structure?" James thought about it for weeks. Then, finally, "I always start excited about a publication's mission, but within a year I start noticing the compromises, the stories we don't pursue because they'd upset advertisers, the editorial slant that serves the ownership's politics, the slow corruption of the journalism I believed in. And then I start to, I don't know, test the boundaries, push harder, write what needs to be written regardless of whether it's commercially viable. And that's when things start to go wrong." His therapist leaned forward. "What if you're not getting fired? What if some part of you is choosing to leave once you've recognized that the publication violates your values?" James sat with that for a long moment. "But I'm not choosing to leave. I'm trying to make it work." "Your ego is trying to make it work. But what if your unconscious, yourself, is sabotaging situations that betray your authentic values? What if it's protecting you from wasting your life in service of institutions that contradict what you actually believe?" This reframe changed everything for James. He started reviewing each firing not as failure, but as message. What was his unconscious trying to tell him by creating circumstances that forced him out? The pattern became clear. Every publication he'd worked for looked good on the surface, prestigious, respected, doing important work. But beneath that surface, each one compromised the values James held most sacred: truth, integrity, speaking power to accountability. And once his unconscious recognized the compromise, it began creating circumstances that would force him out. An email sent to the wrong person, a source relationship that became too controversial, a piece that was brilliant but politically untenable. His therapist suggested these weren't accidents or bad luck. They were the unconscious using mistakes to serve James's authentic path. The self was trying to redirect him away from mainstream journalism and toward something more, aligned with his actual values. But James's ego kept fighting it, kept trying to make conventional success work, kept believing he should be able to thrive in institutions, even when those institutions violated his deepest principles. The firings were the self saying, "No, that's not your path. Stop trying to force yourself into structures that require you to compromise your soul. I'll keep creating circumstances that force you out until you finally listen." James finally listened. He left mainstream journalism and started his own independent publication, smaller, less prestigious, financially uncertain, but completely aligned with his values. No advertisers to appease, no corporate ownership to serve, no editorial compromises. He's been running it for 8 years now. Not once has he experienced the sabotage pattern that plagued his career before, because now his ego's choices and his self's knowing are aligned. This is what I mean by loss as language. James's repeated job losses weren't random. They were communications. The self was speaking, and the language it was using was circumstance. Each firing was a sentence in a message that read, "This path is wrong for you. I'll keep removing you from it until you choose differently." Most people never learn to read this language. They experience loss after loss and interpret it as bad luck, as personal failure, as proof that life is cruel. They never ask, what if there's a pattern? What if there's intelligence operating? What if my losses are trying to tell me something? Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Read that again, because what he's saying is, your unconscious is already directing your life. The question is whether you're doing it consciously, with awareness, with participation, or unconsciously, experiencing your own psyche's interventions as external fate. When you experience loss, especially repeated losses, in a particular area of your life, the question isn't, why is this happening to me? The question is, what is this trying to tell me? Let me give you the loss as language framework, a way of decoding what your unconscious might be trying to communicate. The loss as language framework. 1. Pattern recognition. Look for patterns across multiple losses. Do they occur in similar life areas? Relationships, career, health, location. Do they share timing? Always around certain ages, seasons, life transitions. Do they share themes? Always losing what you've worked hardest for. Always losing what feels most secure. Always losing what others envy. Patterns reveal that something systematic is operating, not just random misfortune. 2. Timing analysis. When do your losses occur? Right when things look most successful. Self-disrupting false success. When you're about to make a major commitment. Self-preventing wrong path. At developmental thresholds. Individuation crisis forcing growth. When you're ignoring internal warning signs, self-escalating from subtle to obvious. Timing often reveals whether the self is preventing something, pushing you towards something, or forcing a necessary developmental transition. 3. What specifically was taken? Not all losses are equal. What exactly did you lose? A relationship that was codependent, self-forcing independence. A career that looked good but felt empty, self-demanding authenticity. A dream that wasn't really yours, self-clearing false paths. Security that kept you from risk, self-forcing growth beyond comfort. The specific nature of the loss often reveals what needed to be removed. 4. What becomes possible? After, what can you do now that wasn't possible before the loss? Geographic freedom. Someone keeping you tied to a location is gone. Identity exploration. Role that defined you is gone. Authentic expression. Someone you were performing for is gone. Values alignment. Situation requiring compromise is gone. What becomes possible often reveals what the self was making space for. 5. What you can no longer avoid. Loss removes options. What are you forced to face now? Your own company. Relationship that distracted you is gone. Your authentic values. Career that contradicted them is gone. Your mortality, health certainty is gone. Your shadow, projection screen is gone. What you can no longer avoid often reveals what you've been avoiding. What the self is demanding you finally confront. 6. Recurring dreams or symbols. Pay Pay attention to your dream life around losses. Are there recurring images? Death, water, fire, falling, flying. Are there symbols that feel significant? Animals, buildings, people. Do dreams preview or process the loss? The unconscious often speaks more clearly in dreams than in waking life, using symbols to communicate what language cannot. There is a moment in every life when the world you thought was solid reveals itself as mist. You reach for what you held most dear, the person, the dream, the identity you wrapped around yourself like armor, and your hand closes on nothing. The absence is so complete, so violent in its silence, that you cannot recognize yourself in the mirror anymore. This is not mere sadness, this is obliteration. This is the ego's crucifixion, and you are nailed to it, gasping, unable to comprehend why the universe would be so cruel as to take from you the very thing that made existence bearable. But what if I told you that this devastation, this complete unraveling of everything you believed yourself to be, was not cruelty at all? What if the loss that brought you to your knees was actually the first honest moment of your entire life? Jung understood something that our modern world desperately tries to avoid, that we build our identities on sand. We construct elaborate fortresses of meaning around external things, relationships, achievements, possessions, roles, and we call this fortress myself. We say, I am a spouse, I am successful, I am loved, I am defined by this person who sees me. The ego, that fragile guardian of our daily consciousness, clings to these definitions with white-knuckled desperation because without them, it fears it will cease to exist. And so we mistake the fortress for the foundation. We confuse what we possess with who we are. The beloved, whether person, dream, or cherished identity, becomes the final proof of our worthiness. Through their eyes, we see ourselves as real. Through their presence, we feel substantial. We project onto them all the unlived potential within us, all the qualities we've failed to recognize in ourselves. They become the carrier of our gold, the mirror in which we finally appear valuable. And then, one day, the mirror shatters. Loss arrives like a thief in the night, but it steals nothing that was ever truly yours. This is the terrible, liberating truth that the ego cannot bear to hear. What you possessed was never possession. It was always a threshold, a doorway, a temporary dwelling place for something the universe was trying to teach you about yourself. The person you loved, the dream you cherished, the identity you wore, these were not the destination. They were the sacred mirror reflecting back the fragments of your own unlived self. The parts of you that you had exiled into projection because you could not yet hold them consciously. When that mirror breaks, when absence replaces presence with such totality that you can barely breathe, you are experiencing what the alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the necessary rot that precedes all transformation. The mystery schools of ancient Greece knew this. The shamanic traditions understood it. Initiation always requires a death, not physical death, but something far more terrifying to the ego, the death of who you thought you were. Grief, then, is not simply an emotional response to loss. It is an initiation ritual, a forced descent into the underworld of your own psyche. You are being stripped, layer by layer, the personas you've worn, the masks that helped you navigate the world, the false selves you constructed to earn love, to feel safe, to belong, are being torn away. And beneath those layers, there is a void, a terrible, howling emptiness where your certainty used to live. This is the ego's nightmare. This is the moment when everything you used to say about yourself stops making sense. But Jung would ask you to look more closely at what is actually dying. Is it you? Or is it the illusion of you, the constructed self that depended on external validation, on possession, on control? on the fantasy that permanence was ever possible in a universe defined by flux. The beloved was never meant to complete you. That is the shadow side of attachment, the unexamined truth we bury beneath romance and need. We love, yes, but beneath that love often lurks a desperate grasping, a hidden belief that this person, this thing, this circumstance will finally make us whole. We use love as a defense against the terror of our own incompleteness. We cling to relationships not as celebrations of two whole beings meeting, but as contracts. Prove to me that I am enough. Reflect back to me the value I cannot find in myself. And so the loss becomes unbearable, not only because we miss the beloved, but because we are forced to confront what their presence was masking, our own refusal to become. We outsourced our wholeness. We made them responsible for the very sense of meaning that only we can generate from within. Now they are gone, and we are left facing the emptiness we've been running from our entire lives. This is enantiodromia, Jung's principle that everything eventually transforms into its opposite. The very thing that brought you joy becomes the source of devastation. Presence becomes absence. Love reveals itself as attachment, as grasping, as a beautiful prison you didn't know you were constructing. The loss exposes the illusion. You never possessed them, and they never possessed you. All along, you were two separate beings, and what you called love was often projection, need, the ego's attempt to avoid its own dissolution. But here, in this unbearable moment of complete shattering, something is trying to be born. The wound is not punishment, it is an opening. The ego's death is the self's invitation. You are being initiated into a mystery that cannot be learned any other way, that your wholeness was never dependent on anything outside yourself, that the gold you saw in the beloved was always your own gold, reflected back to you, waiting to be reclaimed. You cannot see this yet. Right now you are in the tomb, in the darkness, in the breaking. Right now